Cek, cek, one. Cek, cek, cek.
Ladies and gentlemen, in a very short moment, we're going to start our agenda, the seminar on financing transition in ASEAN. So we would like to invite each of every one of you to enter the seminar room because we're about to start. Ladies and gentlemen, we will begin our seminar on financing transition in ASEAN in shortly. So we'd like to invite all of you to enter the seminar room because our seminar is about to start. Ladies and gentlemen, in this lovely afternoon, let us give the warmest welcome to Minister of Finance of the Republic of Indonesia, Ibu Sri Mulyani Indrawati. We'd like to welcome Ibu Sri Mulyani Indrawati at Bali Nusa Dua Convention Center on seminar on financing transition in ASEAN. Selamat datang Ibu dan rombongan pada hari ini. Selamat menempati tempat duduk yang telah disediakan.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Selamat siang, salam sejahtera untuk kita semua. Om Swastiastu, Namo Buddhaya, salam kebajikan. Good afternoon ladies and gentlemen.
Her Excellency Minister of Finance of the Republic of Indonesia, Ibu Sri Mulyani Indrawati.
Our prominent speakers, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen.
It is a pleasure for us to welcome all of you to the BNDCC2 Nusa Dua Bali on seminar on financing transition in ASEAN as a side event of ASEAN Finance Ministers and Central Bank Governors Meeting 2023.
Ladies and gentlemen, let us introduce ourselves. My name is Regine and my partner Faizur. It is an honor for us to be your master of ceremony for today's seminar.
Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. To begin our seminar, we would like to invite the Chief of Financial Services Authority of Indonesia, Mr. Mahendra Siregar, to deliver his welcoming remarks. So please welcome Mr. Mahendra Siregar.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation. Her Excellency Minister Sri Mulyani Indrawati, Honorable Nurafidah Sulaiman, Chair of ASEAN Taxonomy Board, Honorable Febrio Kacaribu, Chairman of Fiscal Policy Agency of the Ministry of Finance. Very good afternoon, distinguished panelists, delegates, and participants. I would like to convey my deep appreciation to the Ministry of Finance for hosting this event. I would also like to take this opportunity to express my gratitude to all those present today, united in our common goal of developing ASEAN taxonomy for sustainable finance, as well as to provide financing transition in our respective countries. As affirmed by many multilateral organizations, analysts, and experts, the ASEAN region is the sole region that is capable of maintaining its economic growth in 2023. Our region plays a significant part in the global economy and has the ability to shape policy initiatives in a rapidly evolving and challenging era such as today. With the increasingly strategic position of ASEAN, the emphasis is on promoting cooperation within the ASEAN region, including in sustainable financing. In this respect, ASEAN will lead by example to fulfill its commitment to one of the biggest global challenges, which is the climate change, to ensure the sustainability of our future. Ministers, honorables, ladies and gentlemen, an essential element of ASEAN taxonomy and national standards that we are developing for financing transition is the importance of orientating our policies toward a gradual transition from fossil fuels toward all sources of renewable energies, including those that may emerge in the future. As we know, within the different groupings addressing the environment, and most importantly, in the COPs of UNFCCC meetings, we have engaged in setting out ever ambitious goals. And while a number of these goals are noble in intent, the gradual transition is essential to ensure that economic and social stability is not undermined. Achieving environmental goals requires political stability supported by vibrant economic and social fabric. There are signs that commitments being made within the UNFCCC meetings are already being undermined in many of the most developed countries, with the reopening of coal mining and power plants and the increased exploration and use of fossil fuels. This reflects the fact that most economies worldwide are still largely geared to fossil fuel generated energy. And related to this, the economic and social disruption caused by a rapid transition. In this context, I believe that it's important to adapt sustainable financing to the overall needs of ASEAN. Indeed, we are a fast-growing developing economy, but still, the alleviation of poverty remains one of our fundamental goals. And we must ensure that economic and social progress and achieving environmental goals are not mutually exclusive, but are fully integrated. In this respect, I would like to suggest that we could also perhaps consider the newly issued ISO 33210 or 33210 on sustainable finance as our good reference. This standard sets out sustainability principles for organizations and stakeholders and provides guidance not only to meet commitments within the Paris Climate Agreement, but also the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which are designed to balance out economic and social progress while safeguarding the environment. This would not only ensure unity of purpose within ASEAN, but it would also carry forward our efforts at the international level, within which we should feel confident to develop our own standards and certifications in support of, among others, our carbon trading system, and in due course to lay the foundations for mutual recognition with our major trading and investment partners covering the environment. Minister, honorable delegates, ladies and gentlemen, let us convince the financial sector that apart from the crucial importance of climate actions, there is financial viability in the transition to sustainability. And that is why gradual and balanced transition plans are urgently and crucially needed. I thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mahendra Siregar, for the remarks. Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it's our pleasure to invite the Chair of ASEAN Taxonomy Board, Ms. Nurafida Sulaiman, to give her welcoming remarks.
So please welcome Ms. Nurafida Sulaiman. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a round of applause for Ms. Nurafida.
Thank you very much. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. And a very good afternoon. Your Honorable Ibu Sri Mulyani Indrawati, Minister of Finance Indonesia. Your Honorable Pak Mahendra Siregar, who's virtually with us, Chair of the Otoritas Jasa Keuangan OJK. Your Honorable Pak Febrio Kacaribu, Chairman of the Fiscal Policy Agency. Ladies and gentlemen, officials and colleagues from across ASEAN, ladies and gentlemen. So firstly, I would like to thank our Indonesian hosts for the splendid arrangement and warm hospitality extended to us delegates of the AFMGM series of meetings in Bali. It is a very great honor to be invited to present my welcoming remarks as the chair of the ASEAN Taxonomy Board at this seminar with the theme Financing Transition in ASEAN. So it is a very timely event and a very important topic at the time when the ASEAN member states are facing the effects of climate change and exploring pathways to transition to a more sustainable activities. We have seen and experienced the devastating effect of climate change within our region itself, where its severity and frequency has intensified and brought disastrous impact to our livelihoods and stability, and also the sustainability of our financial sector. So the timing of today's event also coincides with Monday's publication of our version 2 of the ASEAN Taxonomy for Sustainable Finance, in short, the ASEAN Taxonomy. Your Honorable Ibu, allow me to highlight the ASEAN taxonomies. So slides is behind me. Okay, slide is behind me to show our two version 1, which has been actually published in 10th of November 2021, and following that we have a lot of session with regards to consultation with stakeholders, and we have successfully launched our version 2 just Monday. So again, the ASEAN Taxonomy is a multi-tiered overarching guide to assist the ASEAN member states in their sustainability journey by identifying and classifying sustainable projects and economic activities in ASEAN, comprising of the foundation framework and the plus standard. So it is, if we can go to the next slide, please. Okay. So it is science-based and being inclusive to cater to the different development stages of the ASEAN countries. So the multi-tiered approach comprises of green tier, which is most ambitious and aligned with international taxonomies, and the two amber tiers, which enable activities that are at the transitional stage to be taxonomy aligned. So with the first version of the ASEAN Taxonomy, as I mentioned, that was published back in November 2021, laid out its broad framework, with version 2 consists of, firstly, if I can go to the next slide, sorry, prior to this, please. Okay, so version 2. So firstly, the complete foundation framework comprises of the detailed methodology of assessing sustainable activities. And the second, and the plus standard, it featured the technical screening criteria, the TSC, for the energy sector, which is one of the 6 focus sector, as well as carbon capture, utilization and storage, which is CCUS, as the first enabling sector. And meanwhile, the technical screening criteria for the remaining 5 focus sector will be published in the subsequent version of the ASEAN taxonomy. So in version 2, the ASEAN Taxonomy Board recognizes the need to manage energy security through clean energy investment. So in this context, the ASEAN Taxonomy Board has thoroughly considered how and where the coal phase-outs can play a significant role in the decarbonization to support the Paris Agreement goals. And the benefits of reducing emission from the coal power generation in a managed phase-out have been balanced with the need of the ASEAN taxonomy to facilitate an orderly and just transition. And as such, the ASEAN Taxonomy Board has developed technical screening criteria for the coal phase-out, which aims to promote inclusivity without compromising credibility and interoperability. And the ASEAN Taxonomy Board also recognizes that while the inclusion of the coal phase-out is novel, it provides a powerful tool for transition which approach correctly when it is approached correctly. So we therefore very much look forward to further dialogue with the international community and other stakeholders for its effective implementation. And ultimately, the ASEAN Taxonomy Board hopes that the coal phase-out criteria, which is a unique feature and a global first for a regional taxonomy, encourages early action to reduce the region's reliance on coal as a major energy source. And additionally, the ASEAN Taxonomy Board also strives to address the multifaceted concerns from stakeholders during our previous stakeholders engagement back in 2022, where social aspects were deliberated at length. And as a result, the ASEAN Taxonomy Board, version 2, has also introduced a third essential criteria, which is the social aspect, alongside the do no significant harm and the remedial measures to transition criteria. And the 3 social aspects would be the respect human rights, the prevention of forced and child labor, and the impact of people living close to investment are to be considered as part of the assessment under both the foundation framework and also the plus standard. So very soon, the ASEAN Taxonomy Board will hold targeted consultation with key stakeholders on the assessment methodology, as well as the metrics and technical screening for the energy sector under the plus standard. And we therefore again look forward to engaging with various stakeholders during the consultation in the coming months to ensure that the needs of the financial institution and the real economy continue to be considered. And in doing so, the ASEAN Taxonomy Board aims to achieve our mandate of developing, maintaining, and promoting ASEAN taxonomy that meaningfully and effectively helps to orientate capital towards a sustainable ASEAN and enables each ASEAN members to commence their transition journey immediately, consistent with the ASEAN sustainability ambition. So in closing, today's event is the first in which ASEAN Taxonomy will discuss through the participation of the ASEAN Taxonomy Board representatives, and we very much hope our involvement will meaningfully contribute to the conversations of financing transition in ASEAN. So thank you very much, Ibu, and thank you very much for your time, everyone, and I wish you all a very successful and fruitful seminar. So, wabillahi taufiq wal hidayah. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you, Ms. Nurafida Sulaiman, for the remarks.
Ladies and gentlemen, proceeding to our next agenda, we would like to invite Her Excellency Ibu Sri Mulyani Indrawati, the Minister of Finance of the Republic of Indonesia, to deliver her keynote speech. Ibu Sri Mulyani Indrawati, time is yours.
Thank you so much. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Om Swastiastu, Namo Buddhaya, Salam Kebajikan. Excellency Bapak Mahendra Siregar, the Chairman of Indonesia Financial Sector Authority, which is participating on the screen, Ibu Norafidah Sulaiman, the Chair of ASEAN Taxonomy Board, Pak Febrio, and all my colleagues from the Ministry of Finance, Special Mission Vehicle from Bank Indonesia, and of course all colleagues from the ASEAN, ladies and gentlemen. It is really a pleasure for me to be here to welcome you all this afternoon to Bali. Welcome to Seminar on Financing Transition in ASEAN, a very, very important topic and also dear to my heart in this case, because this is one of the areas that we continue working very, very detailed in identifying how we are going to deliver the transformation toward green economy with the financing support consistent with this scenario in an affordable and just way. So today's seminar, in which we are going to explore a greater depth on the issues as well as opportunity for sustainable finance relating to the climate transition, is very timely and very important. As you all know, this issue also built upon the existing ASEAN reference framework for country-owned country platform. The country platform term has been actually being used during our presidency of the G20, in which Indonesia launching the energy transition mechanism, which actually anchoring with our country platform. And I'm glad that now we also with Vietnam is actually securing this country platform with also support from JETP. So these are all a very, very important topic, but also a complex one. We are not pretending that this is easy as just changing clothes or you just changing one policy. It's a very complex one. So the seminar today, which is addressing also the priority of the ASEAN financial sector readiness for transition finance, is going to be very critical. How the new ASEAN taxonomy, which is already mentioned by Ibu Norafidah, can also becoming part of the solution, interlinkaging the ASEAN member state national taxonomy, which will also at the same time enable to crowd in private sector support for transition. This seminar also hopefully can analyze the perspective from regulatory and supervisory bodies, as well as from many players in this case. This morning, we are very fortunate to have a discussion with US ASEAN Business Council, EU ASEAN Business Council, and ASEAN Business Council, which is, they are all providing us, all the ASEAN Finance and Central Bank Governor meeting, their perspective as well as suggestion based on their real situation. So it's a very fruitful one. We do hope that this is going to be a continued discussion. Ladies and gentlemen, we all know that the transition toward green economy, with at the same time adopting the principle of just and affordable, will require a lot of cooperation. Indonesia, in this case, is already announcing our nationally determined contribution, net zero emission, and many is already mentioned a very important timeline, 2030, 2050, 2060, or earlier in this case. So for that determination to be credible, we need to prepare a roadmap, policy, infrastructure legislation. For example, like the Indonesia, we just introduced carbon market within our legislation. We also just introduced carbon tax. And at the same time, because this is related to very significant investment, they definitely have the social impact mitigation plan, hence it's going to be very important, as Ibu mentioned earlier. In this transition, there will be an opportunity also for a new greener investment. For sure, we know what is the implication and the cost, but we are not yet, and we need to explore what is going to be the new opportunities of this green investment means for creating jobs as well as for boosting the growth for each of the country. We also, in this case, see within the ecosystem the transforming, especially the electric vehicle battery industries, the electric vehicle industry, the solar panel industry, which is becoming now really a hype for many of population. They are all creating a new opportunity as well as new job. We are all also need to know the differences between the immediate short-run, medium implication and long-run gain. In the short run and medium term, to mitigate the negative impact of the transition toward green economy, a country needs to always present primarily how we are going to be able to design this transition with stability and especially affordable price. When I mention affordability, what we have in mind is the affordability, for example, if it is the energy sector, the price of energy which is affordable for the people, the price of energy which is going to be affordable for the business, the price of energy that is going to be also affordable for the public finance or state budget, because usually there is the implication of subsidy or even in this case, loss risk absorption that need to be addressed. So implementing the just and affordable principle is something which is easy to set, but then need a lot of technical work, need also to be tested with the real case. Pak Mahendra mentioned that we need time because an abrupt change will definitely have a lot of casualty and cost. But this morning I also heard when we need time to implement or to design the taxonomy, the climate change is not going to wait. So we really, on the one hand, need more time, but at the same time, climate change also will dictate their damage as well as the implication. So for us, in this case, this kind of issue on how you are going to look at both sides, the demand side and supply side, the transition and how this is going to work. From the demand side, for example, the country need to ensure that the stability of the availability of vital essential services, for example, like power sector, need to be secure. Stability in terms of price is going to be also very important. Public transportation, as well as energy sector in general. The social stability need to be also ensured, and the application of this sustainable development principle need actually provide a confidence and political support from the population. If you are giving too much implication in the short term and immediate terms, it can easily backfire politically. You can see in many countries, especially democratic system, in which you have a good intention, good policy, but they are not acceptable politically. These are all the reality that need to be addressed. So let me now talking about the energy transition mechanism. Indonesia has put the highest priority of this energy transition toward cleaner energy. As Ibu Nur also mentioned and put it in the bracket of this energy, why energy is important? Because this is the most expensive if you talk about the national determined contribution commitment to deliver. This is also the most complex one. The transition that we need to design will have to make sure that the country will continue growing in terms of the economy, employment, but also at the same time, the availability and affordability of the energy or power sector. But at the same time, reducing the CO2 emission according to the commitment on NDC, or in Indonesia, we even have the enhanced NDC. For us, this is very obvious. Fossil fuel, especially coal, dominating our power sector, more than 60% of our energy mix is actually contributed by the coal power sector, power energy. So the question how you are going to increase the renewable energy and at the same time reducing or retiring coal is becoming too very important, because you don't want to retire coal, then the supply of energy is going to be declined, economy growing, then you are facing with the lack of energy to support the economic needs. So how you are going to deal with these two important energy transition mechanism that Indonesia working together with the cooperation and help from Asian Development Bank is the one that trying to address this issue in a systematic, organized way. Decommissioning coal-fired power plant is one of the most important key action as part of our transition to low carbon energy economy. And this ETM will consist of two parts: the carbon reduction facility that is retiring the coal, and the clean energy facility that is building more renewable. And that both require financing. Retiring coal doesn't mean then you let die and then there is no cost. A lot of costs related to that. So how we are going to do that? This approach with the energy transition mechanism has been discussed and consulted with many stakeholders. And I'm actually also appreciate and would like to express our thank you to many stakeholders, whether this is on a public, private, financial sector, multilateral institution, many is actually providing, including philanthropy, both globally as well as Indonesia. The approach that is being designed should be a win-win solution. A win-win for the community of people or community which is surrounded in this coal power plant, investors, regional economies, as well as, of course, should be also win-win for the environment. Indonesia, at this very moment, has made some critical juncture, leading us closer to the implementation of this energy transition mechanism. A lot of work has been dedicated to really develop and testing this idea. We are currently working very closely in focusing, preparing several critical foundation, including what is actually fit with this taxonomy. The taxonomy of transition finance is going to be very critical. How we are going to encourage financial institutions, both domestic as well as global, to channel financing facility to various activity aiming for delivering this net zero emission target. Transition taxonomy will certainly provide a very clarity and a roadmap for all companies, investors, policymakers, and other relevant stakeholders to set a uniform understanding of activity or investment which is classified as transition finance. And this needs to be consistent with the Paris Agreement target. With the taxonomy, we will be able to help promote the credibility of all these related activities, and also each party can see at the same page the same issue that will then provide a good platform for collaboration and coordination. And that's why I'm very, very glad, because ASEAN as a region is actually providing this very important leadership. First, developing the ASEAN taxonomy version 1, which is already being presented earlier, and now even upgraded into version 2. This is the taxonomy that will provide a platform for all of us to see, as mentioned by Ibu Nur, about how we are going to work together within ASEAN and even beyond. The ASEAN taxonomy for sustainable finance, the first version, which is introduced last November 2021, and now in 2023, we've already issuing the second version, which is mainly to accommodate what is on the energy sector. As is already mentioned, it's going to be a very complex, very expensive financing this energy transition. So I'm glad that this is being accommodated and put within the ASEAN taxonomy. And I believe this is among the first taxonomy to accommodate energy transition on its green and amber category. Many of the private sector investment fund, they say that they are interested to finance the transition energy like in Indonesia. But all of them would like to only take the renewable part. If you only take the renewable part without addressing on the coal retirement, then it will not help us. But they are also saying that if we finance on the coal retirement, although this is retiring, but because the word coal is there, then they are going to be seen that you are financing against the green financing. And that's why we are already now communicating and conveying this concern to regulators, including the OJK, in order for us, not by design or unintentionally, punishing the effort of delivering this energy transition, which is very important. For Indonesia, this progress is consistent with what we've already delivered during our G20 Indonesia presidency. At that time, during the leaders' meeting, President Jokowi is already announcing this energy transition mechanism within the context of sustainable finance, and also supported by many other G20 members as well as multilateral institutions and bilateral, to announce the JETP for Indonesia. The amount is 20 billion. Now we are working beyond this rhetoric. How we are going to translate this commitment of 20 billion in order for us to be able to really testing the country and the government which is really committed to this transition. We even want to do the piloting, and then we will see how it will work. What kind of hurdles that need to be addressed. I believe with this kind of approach, pragmatic one, go to the detail, down to earth, no more speeches, is going to make pushing this needle for the climate change action. So I do hope this seminar will provide also opportunity for you to present many of your views related to policy framework, approach, or any other that you feel that this is going to be very important on our collective effort to decarbonization of the economy, but at the same time creating prosperity for all. I should also thank for this opportunity, especially for all of you who are traveling far to come here in Bali to participate in this seminar, as well as in this ASEAN Finance Minister and Central Bank Governor meeting. Please contribute at the maximum to this seminar or other forum, and please also enjoy Bali, because it's important for your health today, in order for you to do the important work for tomorrow. Thank you so much.
Ibu, please do not leave the stage, because right after this we will have a photo session along with all speakers and moderators.
So I would like to invite all moderators and also speakers to step up to the stage, please, to take a photograph with our Minister of Finance, Ibu Sri Mulyani Indrawati. I'd like to invite Ibu Sri Mulyani along with Ms. Nurafida, Mr. Febrio Kecaribu, and also Mr. Parjono on the first line, and then all speakers to come to the stage, please, on the second line. Ladies and gentlemen, we would like to kindly inform you all that tomorrow we will have the agenda of ministerial fireside chat that will be held at 10:30 Bali local time in this exact room. So I hope each of every one of you could visit tomorrow's agenda and enjoy the ministerial fireside chat. Once again, we'd like to invite all speakers and also moderators and Ibu Sri Mulyani to take a photograph together. All right, on our count, 3, 2, 1, let's take a picture. I think that's all, ladies and gentlemen. We would like to thank all moderators and also speakers.
And Her Excellency Ibu Sri Mulyani Indrawati, you may proceed to the next agenda. Thank you, Ibu. To all speakers and moderators, you may kindly return to your seat again. Once again, thank you, Excellency Ibu Sri Mulyani Indrawati. You may proceed to the next agenda. Thank you, Ibu.
And all moderators and speakers, you may be kindly return to your seat again. And once again, I would like to inform all of you that tomorrow we have another seminar that will talk about the ministerial fireside chat that will be held in this exact room and 10:30 Bali local time. So please be there. Ladies and gentlemen, our next agenda is the panel discussion about the ASEAN financial sector's readiness for transition finance. The first panel discussion will discuss about how the new ASEAN taxonomy and its interlinkages with the AMS national taxonomy will enable crowding in of private sector support for transition, perspective of regulator or supervisory body, risks in implementation, and means to mitigate the risks.
Before we start the panel discussion, let us introduce our moderator, Mr. Eugene Wong. He is the CEO of Sustainable Finance Institute Asia, an independent institute established to catalyze ideas on sustainable finance at the policy level in ASEAN, as well as propel action in support of those policy areas. The institute is the host of the ASEAN Taxonomy Board. He previously served as the managing director, Corporate Finance and Investment of the Securities Commission Malaysia, and was closely involved in ASEAN Sustainable Capital Market initiatives, including the ASEAN Green, Social and Sustainability Bond Standards.
So ladies and gentlemen, please give a round of applause for Mr. Eugene Wong.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here, and I'd like to thank the organizers for having us all and the warm hospitality that we've experienced. Let me invite the very esteemed panel to the stage. Let me first start with Mr. Henry Rialdi from OJK, Ibu Yuki, and Pak Khairul Rizwan from the Securities Commission Malaysia representing the ASEAN Taxonomy Board, and Pak Tomo from the NZBA. Thank you very much. Let me give a quick introduction to the speakers. They may all be known to you, but just for the general consumption of everyone here. First, let us start with Pak Henry. Pak Henry is actually the head of surveillance of the Integrated Policy for Financial Services Sector Department of OJK. He has been with the Bank Restructuring Agency and has experience in both banking and corporate finance. And prior to this, he has also been exposed to a wide range of financial activities. So he is now watching over the development policy for the Indonesian taxonomy, including the transition policy for financial institutions. Next is Ms. Yuki Yasui. She's the Regional Director for the APEC Network for the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, or GFANZ, as most of you know them as. And of course, she's focused on bringing together the financial sector across both developed and emerging APEC to accelerate an inclusive and just transition to a net zero economy. And Ibu Yuki previously worked at the UNEPFI and led its Asia-Pacific activities for the last 4 years. Then, of course, we have Pak Khairul Rizwan, who's the Deputy General Manager of International Affairs from the Securities Commission Malaysia. His role covers capital market integration, and also he's involved in initiatives including the Sustainable Finance Working Group of the ASEAN Capital Markets Forum, where the SC Malaysia is co-chair. Importantly, Pak Khairul is an alternate member of the Taxonomy Board. And last but not least, we have Pak Tomo Ishikawa, who is the Managing Director and Head of Government and Regulatory Relations at MUFG. He is responsible for orchestrating the group-wide advocacy strategy on financial and regulatory policies, including climate change. Importantly, he represents MUFG at the global initiatives, including GFANZ and the Net Zero Banking Alliance, where he chairs the transition group at the Net Zero Banking Alliance. And many of you may know that the Net Zero Banking Alliance produced a transition finance guide last year, which has been very interesting. Pak Tomo also worked at the JFSA. So without further ado, let me dive into the topic itself. So we heard Pak Mahendra and Ibu Sri Mulyani talk a lot about the importance of transition for a region like ours. And of course, ASEAN is a very, very diversified region. We have countries with GDPs per capita ranging from $1,300 per annum to 72,000. We may not realize this, but 46% of the emissions that come from our region actually come from the energy sector. And yet 10% of our ASEAN citizens still don't have access to electricity. Now, we are fighting two wars here, rather two battles in a single war in Southeast Asia right now. The first battle is on climate change, and the second is on sustainable development. If we lose either of these battles, we lose the entire war. So it is important for us to be able to fight both these battles at the same time. We can't flick a switch and turn green overnight, as Ibu Sri Mulyani rightly pointed out. What we have to do is to be able to undertake a transition journey. And it is important that this transition journey be orderly, it is important that it be just, and it's important that it doesn't cause social and economic dislocations. At the same time, as Ibu Sri Mulyani mentioned just now, while we want the space to transition, we also want to be ambitious enough. So if you talk about transition, to me, transition is really the balance between the realities on the ground today and keeping true to an ambition. And that's a very tough thing to do. We have livelihoods, we have cost of living issues, and we have the 70 million MSMEs in the region which need to survive and remain competitiveness. How do we ensure that they can do this? How do we ensure that the region as a whole is able to move? So I would like to ask our esteemed panel members to share with us their views, because we are very fortunate we have a very diverse panel here today with very diverse views, and I'd like to ask them to share first, before we kick off, why they think transition is important from their particular perspective. Maybe Tomo-san, I can start with you first.
Is this on? Yeah. Good, good. Thank you. First of all, thank you very much for having me. Pleasure to be here. Let me start answering your question, why transition? From my perspective, the answer is very simple. No 1.5 degrees outcome without transition. It's simple as that. And I know that transition, for some people, is a tricky terminology, because some may take transition as an excuse to keep the status quo. or to lock in the current, whether it's a fossil fuel or coal. Some may argue that this is a kind of just terminology that is useful to say it's, let's just keep the status quo. But I think it differently. First of all, transition by its definition has to have destination. So transition is not something that will, just keep transitioning forever. But transition means there's got to be destination, and destination has to be 1.5 degrees, as it was agreed among all the 200 countries who signed up to it. At the same time, I respect the EU's approach with its taxonomy and sustainable finance action plan, but at the same time, only investment in sustainable field or green will not decarbonize the real economy. At the end of the day, it's not just a balance sheet you need to green, it's the real economy. It's the emission needs to come down. And how do you do that? You also, as we heard from Murisuriani, we need to invest in coal to make those brown greener. How do you do that? It's the transition finance that you need, not only green finance. So that's how I look at it. One last thing I want to mention is that how do we actually scale up transition finance? One could say it's carrot, one could say stick. I don't think stick will work because we need all of us to be part of this journey. So rather than stick, I think carrot has to be implemented. Of course, US came up with this IRA, which I think makes sense, but it could be taxonomy, it could be some other measures. But at the end of the day, we need all of a lot of carrots so that we can encourage each other to mobilize more finance in the transition activities. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tomo. I think that's a very important point because there's a lot of action to try and promote sustainability through exclusion. So if you don't meet a certain guideline, you don't meet a certain criteria, you're out. And that's the stake. But in a situation where Ibu Sri Mulyani was talking about the balance between demand and supply, the stick alone is not going to change enough. So we need to promote sustainability through inclusion, and I think transition is something which inclusion is a priority with. And Pak Khairul, the ASEAN Taxonomy Board, in this respect, has been trying to promote transition through inclusivity.
Yep, that's right, Eugene. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I think an important aspect to look at when we are considering a regional taxonomy, especially in a region where there are 10 countries with different levels of economic development, different starting points, in fact, is trying to find a common voice. And in this regard, traditional taxonomies, and by maybe traditional is not the best word, but perhaps the most known taxonomy so far, the EU taxonomy, has a certain approach in addressing its purposes. But we feel that in a country, or rather a region such as ASEAN, transition is important because we, or all 10 ASEAN member countries, cannot meet the same level of thresholds or criteria that a taxonomy may set. Now, in this regard, I think from the start, the ASEAN Taxonomy Board has laid out very key principles among the 5 principles that in developing the taxonomy. So this include the taxonomy being an overarching guide for all ASEAN member states in guiding their own sustainability initiatives. But also, the taxonomy will consider other taxonomies in its development, but contextualizing these features to transition or create a transition path for ASEAN member states. And perhaps the most important one is that the taxonomy must be beneficial to all ASEAN member states. So in this regard, the feature of transition is very important in that it helps those ASEAN member states with different starting points to come to a place where I think the region can be seen as addressing sustainability and to create a transition pathway for the region. Thanks.
Thank you. And I know GFANS has been working very hard on transition as well, because obviously, again, without that funding flow, without the orientation of capital, transition cannot happen. But please tell us, Ibu Yuki, why is transition so important from the perspective of the FIs?
Yeah, thank you, and very happy to be here. Good afternoon, everyone. So, what I want to put out first is the 4-to-1 investment ratio that we are convening to our members at the moment. So right now, today, every dollar of investment to fossil fuel is currently more or less matched with investment in the low carbon economy. That's 2022 data from Bloomberg NEF. And they've calculated that for us, as the global community, to achieve the 1.5-degree goal, we need to quadruple that effort. So for every dollar of fossil fuel investment that still needs to happen in the real economy, $4 need to be going into the low carbon economy. And most of that actually in Asia Pacific, is about supporting the brown economy to go green. So that's the transition. And I think that is the really important part that GFAN's members globally and especially in Asia are working.
So it's clear that we do need a lot of funds to support the brown economy to go green, and you just can't say we can go green overnight because we just don't have that self-capital allocation. Thank you. Henry?
Yeah, thank you. Very nice to be here. Our view is that, specifically for Indonesia, as Bu Sri Mulyani said, dependence on coal for the overall development of the economy is quite high. 14% of our export proceed comes from coal energy. And in terms of investment, due to the fact that Indonesia relies so much on coal or brown sector, the investment pattern or structure of investment in most financial institutions is geared towards that. Sudden stop of investment would cause destabilization in terms of the financial stability of the system. That's our perspective, in a sense, why transition is crucial, not just in terms of the funding needed, but the phasing out of existing investment in the portfolio of financial institutions is quite crucial also. That has to be managed in order not to cause destabilization in terms of financial sector. Thank you.
Thank you, Pa. And that is an extremely important point, because when the ASEAN Taxonomy Board received its mandate from the ASEAN finance ministers and central bank governors, it was to create a taxonomy that will be able to facilitate an effective and orderly transition. I think that point you made is extremely important because it is fundamental to our approach to transition. We all know transition is very important. There's no argument at all about that. And when you talk about transition finance, you see a lot of people getting very excited. But the problem is, we don't see enough of transition finance. So why is that the case? We also hear whispers about greenwashing. What are the trends that we are seeing now? What are the opportunities and what are the challenges to transition finance? Because we really need this money, obviously, from what Ibu Yuki is saying. We need this money very badly to be able to win at the decarbonization game. Maybe I can invite Yuki to start first.
Yeah, I guess just to answer your question about why there's not enough transition financing going on, one of the reasons is that I think in the past, a lot of the financial institutions were looking at their own financed emissions a lot and worrying about, if I take on supporting the brown economy to go green, that will impact our financed emissions. Financed emissions means the emission, scope 3 emission, the carbon footprint for financial institutions that is supporting the real economy. So if they finance a coal power plant, it means that they will carry on part of the coal power plant's CO2 emission into their portfolio. And that has led to, in the early days, a divestment plan, a divestment strategy to just walk away from high-emitting sectors. I think today that idea has started to change, that people have started to realize the importance of supporting the real economy decarbonization, and that if you just divest, that there is a paper decarbonization on the part of the financial institutions, but that the real economy has not changed at all. And so our members have started to think about how can they participate in supporting the brown to green, the just transition, the transition finance in a manner that is still credible and financially viable, as well as taking into account the just transition elements as well.
Thank you. So this fits very much into what Henry was saying, because if we look at it structurally, much of our financial system has been geared to cater to two things. The first is that we are geared to handle something more linear, which is the green investments, and we are trying to change that. The second is that we may have parts of the financial system that's hardwired into supporting the existing economic structure, and that structure may not be consistent with a green structure. So we don't want to cause the instability, yet we want to be able to move forward. So, Henry, what other areas do you see where there are significant challenges and opportunities for transition finance? Because I think this is a very important area that regulators need to come and provide some support to create a pathway to break the deadlocks, and maybe even to change the rules of the game so that we can enable transition financing to happen.
I think one of the major challenges is in terms of financial regulator, especially standard setting body, is to address transition finance as a new subject with a new paradigm. As we know, the transition towards a greener economy entails costs. In terms of financing, this is a new area. It increases costs by 1 to 2%. If the translation of a transition finance into prudential matrices from a standard, a regulatory standpoint, is not treated delicately, it might entail additional burden in terms of how that translates into prudential requirement. For example, right now, the standard setting body has already set up projects with regards to stress testing, with regards to risk assessment of incorporating climate towards their business activities. If this translates into an additional burden of maybe capital charges for financial institutions, then it would deter the transition process. It would deter financial institutions to be able to support this measure. That's why the paradigm of transition should be also incorporated in terms of how standard setting bodies view this area in order to support the process.
Thank you, Pa. So what you're suggesting is actually that when we talk about regulatory discipline and rules, those regulatory actions must be able to drive transition forward rather than impede them, because there's always a danger that if we try and extend too far from a regulatory perspective, you're actually doing something which is counterproductive. And Pak Khairul, given that the ASEAN taxonomy has been addressing this issue of transition and trying to create inclusivity, do you think that the taxonomy will actually be able to help transition more?
I think so, Eugene. In fact, one of the things you mentioned earlier, concerns about greenwashing and so on, and I think when we first mooted the principles and the framework of the taxonomy in version 1 of the taxonomy, in our engagements, I think there were concerns about the so-called amber tiers of the taxonomy, in that that there were concerns of possible greenwashing there if we had a lesser sort of threshold or technical screening criteria for certain activities. However, I think to address this, I think as I stated earlier, there is a need to cater for the region, to provide inclusivity, and the realization was that we cannot let the perfect be the enemy of the good. It's always good to have a starting point in which users or jurisdictions can start their sustainability journey, rather than have ambitious targets which which will discourage any action at all. So that's one part on the addressing possible greenwashing. But perhaps another challenge that we face, and not just ASEAN, but all taxonomies in fact face, is the availability of high quality data to measure number one, taxonomy alignment, and also in the case of transition, to track the progress of the transition pathway or transition journey. So this, in fact, was one of the issues raised by investors in a workshop held by PRI and the UNEPFI in late 2022, when talking about the EU taxonomy. So that lack of high quality data is there, I mean, regardless of where you are. But in tandem with that, in the past year, we've seen the advent of I think some harmonization or coming together of a global standard on disclosures, such as the ISSB standard, which I think is coming out in June of this year. So it will be a step towards improving the quality of such information. But I think we still have that issue of readiness of jurisdictions and corporates to align themselves with such standards. But I think that's a step in the right direction.
So you raised two very important points. One is on the readiness of jurisdictions, and the other is on the approach of the ASEAN taxonomy. I'd like to come back to that later, but for now I'd like to invite Pak Tomo to share his views about the challenges and the opportunities, because from the NZBA perspective, I'm sure you see many of these issues and are working very hard to overcome them.
Sure. So what do we need to scale up transition finance? So the way I look at it is no transition finance without transition plan, no transition plan without transition finance, right? So taxonomy will definitely contribute many companies and also financial institutions to prepare transition plans. But taxonomy itself will not be sufficient, right? You can't just look at the taxonomy and say, okay, are you going to finance or not? If you're structuring green bond, maybe that's a different story. But if you're thinking about, if you're about to decide whether you want to lend to a big corporate who's trying to reduce their emissions, you can't just look at one activity and say, this is taxonomy compliant, whether it's the EU, ASEAN taxonomy. Of course, that's a very important assessment that you have to do, but you have to look at the whole of company, whole of group decarbonization plan for the next 20, 30 years, and then decide whether you can really think the transition plan is credible and you finance, as opposed to just look at, again, activities only. So I think what we are waiting for is, as some of my fellow panelists discussed, disclosure, ISSB, and all the disclosure framework, they are also incorporating transition plan to be included as part of disclosure. So I think in the next 2 years or so, more companies will disclose transition plan, which will help us assess their transition plan so that we can identify the transition financing opportunities. And that's how I think you will see all of us financing transition plans, which I would call transition finance. One last thing. Eugene, you mentioned about 47% or so CO2 in ASEAN coming from electricity. Actually, the number in Japan is higher. It's 49%. Whereas, for example, France, 13%, UK, 22%. What does that mean? It means in ASEAN, same in Japan, you have to invest more in energy sector for other sector to decarbonize, whereas if you're France or UK, you don't have to invest in energy. Of course, you will have to, but the more important sector that you have to invest is, for example, transportation. So that's why the pathway from here, where we are, to net zero by 2050 will be very different. And as Yuki mentioned, finance emission for the European banks may simply go down if they decide to invest in, for example, electric vehicle, et cetera, finance emission may not go up. But in our case, or in ASEAN case, the finance emission will probably go up because you have to front load the investment for the energy transition. But I think that's the right thing to do. And from there on, there will be more opportunity for transition finance, especially in the green technologies.
Thank you. That's an interesting insight. And the other thing you raised about how we can't rely on taxonomies alone, I think that's absolutely true. And for those of you who have looked at the guiding documents for the ASEAN financial markets, which is the ASEAN Capital Market Forum's Roadmap for ASEAN Sustainable Capital Markets, the Working Committee on Capital Market Development's report on promoting sustainable finance in ASEAN, and the Central Bank's report on the role of central banks in managing climate and environmental risks in ASEAN. All three of those reports have one thing in common. They point to the fact that we need several elements to make this work. The first is actually a common language, which is a taxonomy. We have been working very hard on that in the region. And I congratulate all the central banks, capital market regulators, insurance regulators, and ministries of finance for having put out version 2 of the taxonomy. The other thing that we need, which is essentially a pillar, is transition pathways, because the taxonomy can tell you the what, but like Tomo-san said, the how-to is a different story, and you need to have that pathway clearly articulated and clearly thought through if you are going to decarbonize, because this is an economy-wide initiative. It is not something that's confined to one sector. It's not something that's confined to one company. It is economy-wide. And the third thing we need is disclosures, like Pak Cairo was saying, because you can have all the different taxonomies, all the different pathways, but if there is no accountability to stakeholders, or there's no information out for informed decision making, then all the taxonomies and pathways don't count for very much. The other important thing which I wanted to pick up on was this issue about the lack of data, and also the difficulty in maybe creating criteria for transition pathways. And that we know is difficult in a region of 70 million MSMEs. So I just wanted to ask the panelists how they feel we should be tackling the issue of the lack of a target. I mean, we've all heard about the SBTI. It is an extremely efficient way to look at things, but for an MSME, it may be a difficult approach to adopt, because it might be a bit tougher for them. So I'm wondering whether the panelists have any idea what could be an alternative to that. Perhaps I can start with Pak Henry.
Yes, thank you. Yes, MSME is quite interesting topics. Unlike corporates, in which approaches like taxonomy might be useful, incorporating such approach to the MSME would entail additional burden for them. In addition, it has the guidance given to MSME must be simple enough, in a sense it is implementable at the operational level, but have a common language with the financial institution. One interesting approach is guidance similar to the foundation approach uses in the Asian taxonomy, in which it provides quite a flexible guidance, but it's quite understandable and implementable. Hence, for MSME, I think we must diverge from the path of a taxonomy approach and uses a much more principle-based approach, but also in a common language with the financial institution. Hence, communication between the two can be established.
It's, I think it's quite intriguing how you have thought about the foundation framework being able to act as a common language between the MSMEs and the FIs. Because naturally it's going to be very difficult for the MSMEs to be moving towards using thresholds, given that there's a lack of data. But if you want them to immediately be able to start something with the FIs, then that is a common language they can use. I think that's a very interesting point, which maybe the ASEAN Taxonomy Board can also take into consideration as they improve the taxonomy moving forward. So I wanted to move on to the taxonomy, because we are talking a lot about the taxonomy now, and to ask Pak Khairul to share a bit first about the ASEAN taxonomy, because you mentioned just now about how the taxonomy was meant to actually be inclusive and to promote transition, and version 2 was released on Monday, as the chair of the ASEAN Taxonomy Board, Ibu Nur Rafidah, said just now. And can you tell us about how version 2 tries to do this? I mean, version 1 already created the tiers in the Plus Standard Foundation framework, so everyone can get on board and start using the taxonomy immediately. But can you tell us how version 2 hones in further on this and tries to promote that sort of transition, particularly in the context of what Pak Tomo said, which is energy is a big issue in Southeast Asia, and I know version 2 concentrates a lot on energy.
Thank you, Eugene. So I think, as you mentioned, version 1 touched on transition, the framework for that already. And I think, as a bit of background for those who are not entirely familiar with the ASEAN taxonomy, the ASEAN taxonomy has a multi-tiered framework. So you have the foundation framework, as I think Pak Henry mentioned just now, where it's a principles-based assessment of activities, which I think we expect most, or if not all, ASEAN member states can adopt. But we also have the Plus Standard, which provides more guidance with technical screening criteria focused on, I think, the sectors which we find to be most has the most greenhouse gas emissions. And also has the greatest value in terms of economic activity in ASEAN. So you have multi-tiers there, the amber, the green, and I think, as I alluded to just now, we have the amber category, which helps transition those I think jurisdictions who want to embark on I think a clearer or more specific approach to the taxonomy assessment to adopt these tiers on their transition journey. Of course, what we have in the taxonomy as well is that these tiers are to be retired, the lower tiers are to be retired in time, so that people or rather jurisdictions move up, move up the chain in terms of transition to the green category or tier. Now, I think what is in version 2 which adds on to that, firstly, I think we're talking about a just and orderly transition, and the version 2 addresses that in a couple of ways. Firstly, we have the DNSH criteria, which is do no significant harm. Now that has, although it was identified in the first version, it has been expanded on in detail in version 2, and in fact you have an entire annex, which is Annex 2, which deal with the way in which DNSH is to be assessed. So DNSH is essentially saying that when you do have, when you're assessing your activity, it's important that it does no harm to the other environmental objectives within the taxonomy. And a second part of it is the inclusion of social aspects as the third essential criteria in the taxonomy. So version 1 had 2 essential criteria. Now the third one is social aspects, and this was something that was brought up during our consultation held last year as well. I think the respondents and the stakeholders we engaged with brought up this aspect quite a number of times on how ASEAN would be treating social. So it basically requires that an activity to be taxonomy aligned must not have negative impact on the employees or people involved in that activity or its surrounding community. And 3 social aspects addressed in the taxonomy are promotion and protection of human rights as the first, prevention of forced labor and protection of children's rights, and thirdly, impact on people living close to investments. So we have those aspects. And thirdly, I think as I think was addressed by the keynote speakers earlier just now, version 2 tries to address countries that are trying to transition their energy sourcing from polluting ones to those which are more renewable. So coal phase out, addressing coal power plants and their early retirement is one aspect which I think is very unique to the ASEAN taxonomy. It is a taxonomy aligned activity under the energy sector, which is the first sector which we are giving technical screening criteria to. And I think as everyone knows, it's the thinking globally is that burning of thermal coal is a major contributor to global warming, but coal is an important source of energy for many countries in the region. So there should be a just transition for these countries to change to more renewable sources, but while at the same time addressing their energy needs. And I think if I may speak a bit more on this and going into the technical screening criteria itself for coal phase out. Although we can perhaps regard it as a transition activity, which you might associate with amber, the ASEAN taxonomy does have a green tier for coal phase out as well. In that, I think in certain circumstances where a set of criteria which is quite strict is complied with, it could qualify as a green category for financing, and one aspect of that is it's internationally recognized by bodies or programs such as the ETM or the JETP. But of course, some common criteria is that coal-fired power plants built after a certain date, which is 31st December 2022, which is in the past, won't qualify for this. So it seeks to address, not the new coal power plants that are coming on board, but those which are in place, and to seek the early cessation of their activities. And of course, having the 2 amber tiers, as I mentioned earlier, helps to address, I think, the entire gamut of coal-fired power plants and their approaches and policies which are in different ASEAN member states. Unlike Indonesia and I think certain other countries such as the Philippines, some countries do not have a coal phase-out policy in place yet. So we hope inclusion of this aspect in the taxonomy would serve as a guide for all the member states in ASEAN, in line with I think the principle of the taxonomy being an overarching guide to guide ASEAN member states on their sustainability journey. Thanks.
So let me just follow up on a point which you made, which is the taxonomy is an overarching guide. Many ASEAN member states either have their own taxonomies or are coming up with their own taxonomies, including Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore. Thailand has just put up for consultation. Vietnam is coming up with one, and the Philippines has announced they'll use the foundation framework of the ASEAN taxonomy. But apart from that, how do you see the national ASEAN taxonomies fitting in with the regional taxonomy? Just very quickly.
Very quickly, I think there were some taxonomies which, the Malaysian Central Bank's taxonomy, I think, started a consultation paper before the ASEAN taxonomy issued their first version. Singapore, of course, has their GFIT taxonomy, and we already see this convergence of, I think, principles which align themselves to different parts of the ASEAN taxonomy. So we do have the principles-based taxonomy approach, which has been adopted by Malaysia Central Bank, and also the Securities Commission's SRI taxonomy, which is aligned with the foundation framework of the ASEAN taxonomy, but also the plus standard and the technical screening criteria of the ASEAN taxonomy is also aligned with Singapore, and I think Thailand as well, when coming up with their taxonomy, has taken this approach as well. So, and I think an important part of this is that the people who are involved in developing these national taxonomies are in many aspects the same people who are developing the ASEAN taxonomy. So we will hopefully see a convergence in the ASEAN taxonomy.
Right. So what you're saying is that the national taxonomies address national agendas and national priorities, and they will come up with their own approaches, but the ASEAN taxonomy actually is like the roof over all of them, and because the ASEAN taxonomy actually has multiple tiers, for those who are adopting a technical screening criteria, they'll be able to fit one of their technical screening criteria into one of the tiers then.
That's right.
Right. That sounds very workable, because if we didn't have that, then we'll just have another taxonomy. But now what we have is a converter of regional taxonomy. So that's really good. So I do want to ask a very important question to Ibu Yuki and Pak Tomo. We talked about thresholds, and we know that the ASEAN member states are aligning their national thresholds into one of the thresholds of the ASEAN taxonomy. What happens with the non-ASEAN states? So if we face an international taxonomy, we may find that their thresholds are very different. We may also find that the frameworks we're using in ASEAN could be very different from what's out there in the rest of the world. So can I just get some views from you on that?
Can I maybe start then? So if I may step back a little bit, what I said maybe 10, 15 minutes ago was that no transition finance without credible transition plan. That's what I said. So what is credible? That is the question now. And my answer to that would be no credibility without benchmark. And I think taxonomy is a benchmark. Having said that, benchmark or technical screening criteria is just a number, right? And of course, you could ask your client and say, have you reached this, whatever 100 gram, whatever the technical criteria is, and your client may say, yes, we're on the right track, or we have achieved. But that's just a number, right? That is not good enough to actually make investment decision. So as I said earlier, you need to have a comprehensive plan so that you can actually understand whether the plan is realistic or not. And you mentioned about the outside of ASEAN, and I feel the same way when we look at the EU taxonomy as well. again, taxonomy is useful when you think about assessing the technology, how good is it, how sustainable is it, but at the end of the day, you need to look at outside of taxonomy as well, the plan as a whole and say, are you really comfortable that this company or this project will be successful over the next 30 years, as opposed to just look at the numbers. So that's how I look at it, that's number one. So threshold is a useful to assess the technology, but that's not the end of the story. That's one thing. The other thing I wanted to mention was that we talk a lot about stranded assets. Stranded asset, at the end of the day, it's about money, right? We could somehow write that off if necessary, but you cannot write off stranded human capital or stranded people. You don't want to create stranded people, right? So how do you actually do that? That's not a number. And I appreciate this, do no significant harm, et cetera, but how do you actually make sure that people actually working in, for example, coal mining pit or whatever, can actually find a decent job? And that's not going to happen overnight, as you said. That will take some time. So we can't just look at CO2 only. Of course, that's very important, but how do you make sure that people actually working or the community will have the opportunity to again, transition from where we are and where they have to be over the next whatever the years, right? So that's the type of comprehensive assessment that you have to do. And it's not just one institution who can do that. I think it has to be involved, and all the society, the government has to be part of this undertaking. So again, taxonomy is very important foundation, but there are so many other aspects that you also have to take into consideration.
I think that point about the human capital is a very important point because it is about people. Ibu Yuki?
Yeah, thank you. So I think what Thomas-san was saying earlier about taxonomy, to put that into practice at the financial institutions level, you need the transition planning. And between that, you do need more guidance on some of the more newer types of finance. And I think transition finance is exactly where we are currently lacking a lot of the guidance and standards. So at GFANZ in Asia Pacific, we've launched a work stream where we are developing guidance for financial institutions on how to finance and manage phase out of coal. And so it's very complementary to what the ASEAN taxonomy is doing around coal phase out. And we will definitely be referencing that. But what we're looking at is, for example, when we're looking at the credibility of what is a managed phase out of coal power plants, we are not just looking at a criteria for, say, an asset, but also we are looking at criteria for the entity, the utility or the asset owner. And also we're looking for criteria for the country as well. So we're looking at it in three levels. We're also looking at the financial viability, because they are usually the credibility and the financial viability tend to be push and pull. They tend to balance each other off. And we want to make sure that we are able to identify a lot of financial levers that financial institutions can go and make use of. So at the moment, there are a lot of new emerging innovative financial levers that are emerging that financial institutions can go and look at. So our guide will identify the latest levers that are around, and to try and put together some illustrative models to showcase that managed phase out can be structured, sometimes purely commercially in some cases, but mostly with some blended finance and carbon credits and renewable energy replacement revenues and so forth included in it as well. And then the last thing that we are looking at is the social inclusivity or the just transition. Now, compared to, like, say, South Africa, in Asia, when we talk about managed phase out of coal, we're not talking about coal shutdown in like the next few years. We're actually looking at a longer commitment, which could be the next 10 years, or even a little bit longer than that. In South Africa, we're talking about the next 5 years. And so when we talk about just transition, actually, we have a bit of time to plan ahead and make sure that the just transition happens. It's not like we're, shutting down coal mines today and everyone is losing their jobs and so forth. So I think in that context, ASEAN has that luxury to plan ahead, and it has the luxury to plan ahead not just on the social and just transition, but also on how they want to shift the energy transition in Asia. Thank you.
Thank you. So it's instructive that we are no longer just talking about the interoperability of, say, taxonomies, but we are talking about how frameworks can be complementary to each other and reinforce each other, because there's a point you made, Tomo-san, and a point Ibu Yuki made as well. Right, so I just wanted to make an interim announcement first before we move on to the next question, and that is tomorrow at 10:30 we have the ministerial fireside chat. And I hope that all of you can join, because we'll hear more ideas from the ministers of finance of Indonesia, Singapore, and Thailand about transition finance and the importance of the transition journey. So I'll move on to my last question, which I hope all of you can give me one idea in 1 minute about what we should do moving forward. And I will start with Pak Henry.
Thank you. I think what has been lacking is a discussion between the financial sector and the sector that is, we are talking about, the energy sector or the brown sector. I think in terms of aligning their policy, their pathways with respect to financial policy is crucial in a sense so that it's operational in terms of what policy is issued. I think that's one thing that needs to be improved. I mean, let's say, for example, the technical standards or the threshold developed by the financial sector, is it feasible for the energy sector to implement that? That discussion is needed in terms of making the transition process much smoother. I think that's quite crucial.
Thank you, Pa. Yuki?
Yeah. From my side, I think we're at an interesting stage on transition financing discussions where private finance has really taken on a lot of interest and are ready to deploy a lot of capital in this space. Still, lacking a lot of guidance and standards where GFANZ and the ASEAN taxonomy can support that. But there needs to be a lot of dialogue still with the government and the policymakers on how public finance and also the policies and regulations can really crowd in the private finance and make sure that private finance really does the work and that the public finance and the policies support that. So I think that's important. In terms of managed phase out of coal, Indonesia has made a lot of commitment under their JET-P announcements, but what we're still lacking is the commitment of no new coal, for example. If we had that, I think that would really help in driving managed phase out in a very short space of time. So yeah, that would be one idea. Thank you.
Thank you. Cairo?
So going forward, after this, I suppose what we hope to see in the ASEAN Taxonomy Board is perhaps more alignment of common objectives of member states. I mean, we've seen before. I mentioned before that there is alignment already in various taxonomies. Going forward, there are countries which are looking to the ASEAN taxonomy to set their own requirements in the national taxonomy. So we will see more convergence, more alignment, and that's what we hope will happen, so that we want to reduce fragmentation as much as possible and make it easier for users of taxonomies to have guidance for the region.
Thank you. And last but not least, Pak Tomo.
Thank you. It says time's up. So I guess I
Sorry,
only have
we'll
2 seconds.
We'll make it special for you.
Yeah. So if I can just go back a little bit. So what I said in the last hour or so was no 1.5 degrees outcome without transition. That's what I said. No transition plan without transition finance. That's what I said. And no credibility without pathway. Right. So what does it mean? I hope we can agree to what I said. And then let's get on with it. That's the message I have. And sometimes the criticism, greenwashing or lock-in, stranded assets, that I appreciate that. But as you heard from Murisunyani, we're talking about 20 billion for JET-P, but that's not good enough. We need $1 trillion every year for ASEAN or Asia to decarbonize. That's the amount we're talking about. So how do we do that? You just have to move on and actually start mobilizing capital as opposed to discuss what is the right pathway, et cetera, because things are dynamic. Let's actually take on, capital mobilization and then think how can we upgrade further as opposed to just continue this discussion about how do you avoid greenwashing, because that's very important agenda, but we will lose time, we will waste our time, and the carbon budget will be run out. So that would be my suggestion. Let's move on and start mobilizing capital. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's not just time's up for this panel, it's time's up for all of us if we don't move very quickly on this agenda. So it's time to stop talking and start doing. With that, please join me in thanking the very, very entertaining panel we've had today. Thank you very much for all your insights.
Thank you, Mr. Eugene Wong, for the interesting first panel discussion. Kindly return to your seat. Thank you.
And I would like also to thank all speakers for giving the insight towards us today. Thank you, Mr. Eugene Wong, and kindly return to your seat again. We would like to invite all speakers and also moderator to take a picture together on our count. 3, 2, 1. All right, thank you very much for our moderator and also speakers. You may kindly return to your seat again.
Distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, for the second panel, we will discuss about transition standards. The session will discuss the importance of transition standards and for ASEAN countries to provide a common perspective on the requirements to attract financing for transition activities.
And before we start our second panel, we would like to introduce our moderators for the second panel, Ms. Naida Krishna Morgado. She is Senior Infrastructure Specialist, ASEAN Development Bank. She designs climate finance instrument in Southeast Asia and helped set up this ASEAN Catalytic Green Finance Facility. And previously, Naida led green investment and development work at the OECD Development Cooperation Directorate in Paris. Naida has a master's in environmental sustainability with distinction from the University of Edinburgh.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Ms. Naida Krishna Morgado.
Good afternoon, everyone. Just to check, you can hear me probably. That's good. Yeah, great. Well, I hope everybody has enjoyed the first discussion. I certainly did. It's always great to see Eugene. I have to say, nobody thanked you, but you were amazing as a moderator, and I think probably no one in this room knows this topic better than you, so privileged to hear you moderate an excellent panel discussion to start off this the seminar today. We have one session more to go. I'd like to spend a little bit of this session listening to another super distinguished and very interesting panel, but then I would like to turn it over to the audience and I'd like to hear some questions from you, some points that you'd like to clarify, and our panel can cover them, and if it can't, we'll pull up some of the panelists from the previous session to Eugene, so stay alert. So to start with, I'd like to invite my speakers for today. Edwin Sharazud from PTSMI, so please can you come to the stage. Mr. Coben Kaloon from the Rocky Mountain Institute, Mr. David Elzinga from the ADB, and Mr. Tim Collier from Oliver Wyman. Thank you. Any order? Thanks. So thank you and welcome to this panel. And I'd like to start by thanking Ministry of Finance Indonesia and other stakeholders in Indonesia for hosting this panel and this seminar today. For me, I've been working on climate issues for my entire career, and it is amazing to see a discussion on something, let's say, as technical, but also as much in the center of the heart of climate change as the topic ever will be, in the middle of a week of ASEAN finance ministers or finance ministers. So it's really a central part of this discussion, and it's so exciting that it's so mainstream today as a big step forward from 20 years ago. So I must say that is amazing. The first panel already touched on several of the topics I think that we probably would like to hear in the second session as well. But before I start, I'd like to introduce the panel that we have, which complements very well the panel that we had before. First and foremost, I'd like to introduce Pa Edwin Sharuzad, who is the President Director at PTSMI. He's in charge of overseeing the overall operation of the company, including the development of the company's long-term strategy and its compliance to good corporate governance. So thank you, Pa Edwin, for joining us today. I'd then like to introduce Mr. Koban Kalhoun, who's Regional Director for Rocky Mountain Institute for Southeast Asia. He has 15 years of experience and probably more working on clean energy transition, so really at the center of this discussion today, and with a focus on power sector decarbonization. I'd then like to introduce my colleague, David Elzinga from the ADB. David is Principal Energy Specialist and lead for ADB's Energy Transition Mechanism Program, which was already well covered, I think, today by Minister Mulyani. So David, I'm not sure what else you're going to add because you already covered everything, but I'm sure you can give us more of the kind of technical detail. David has worked in sustainability and climate change, both public and private sector, for over 20 years, with a focus on innovation, infrastructure, policy, finance. So he's really covered all the bases. And finally, last but definitely not least, Timothy Collier, who is head of Oliver Wyman in Indonesia and lead for Oliver Wyman's climate and sustainability practice, and really involved in their support for financial services companies across ASEAN and how they take on the implications of climate risk in their business. So we have a really solid panel today. And the way I'd like to start is by maybe a couple of reflections first. So Eugene very nicely put the kind of broad context within which we're operating. We're fighting two battles in the region in Southeast Asia. I'd like to add that we're actually fighting those battles against the backdrop of a ticking clock. We heard, the IPCC results from, is it a week or 10 days ago? We have 7 years to make or break the 1.5 degree target. Even if we do the 1.5 degree target, we're already taking on the costs of climate change today. Even with the 1.5 degree target, we're going to continue to take it on. If we go beyond that target, the costs are only going to increase over time. So we're all working in a space of kind of increased angst and urgency and kind of pressure. So we need to move quickly, Eugene, as you pointed out at the end of your session. The second reflection I'd like to have is we talked a lot about the taxonomy and how important it is, but I think Tomo-san, in fact, made a really good point, which is a taxonomy, and this taxonomy, the one in ASEAN and others, sets out a threshold. It's a point, a data point in time. But transition, by nature of what it is actually a journey and a movement, right? So one data point in time is a good starting point, but it's not where you end, or even maybe where you really mobilize financing for transition. It's only one part of that broader picture. The discussion that I hope we can have in the session today is maybe a little bit about that broader context. What do we need to mobilize financing for the transition? How is the taxonomy important, but what else is important? And what I've noticed as somebody who spent several years in my career focusing on how to measure greenhouse gas emissions from infrastructure is that often big decisions about what we build and what we pay for comes back to how we measured something, how we defined it, and what are the lines we drew around it or didn't draw around it, which is why I think this discussion is particularly important. To start with, I'd like to ask each of my panelists to maybe spend a couple of minutes on introducing the work that you're doing on transition, how it fits into the context of Indonesia or ASEAN. Pak Edwin, if we can start with you.
Thank you.
First of all, good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure for me to be here in the panel discussing about the challenging topics. I think, first of all, I would like to start with energy transition. Of course, the topics and relevant role that PTSMI is playing in this part, because we are also assigned by the MOF as country platform managers. And I think the goal of the energy transition is basically in line with the government commitment to achieve net zero emission by 2060. And I think, to me, as Ibu Menteri has mentioned, it is the beginning of the journey, and we have to come into a detail when it comes to transitioning our energy sectors and of course the economy. If the story is transition for the just and affordable way. So let me first, I think, describe the role, I think, that are given to PTSMI as a country platform. We are going to be providing, of course, a blended finance for supporting energy transition, and I think it is also relevant to refer to Pak Tomo, mentioned in the previous panel. Transition taxonomy is, I think, first thing first, that will determine our pathway of providing transition finance. But the challenge is that if we have to showcase, I think, concrete projects or concrete transition, transition projects, or to be more concrete, is transition as an asset class. Transition project as an asset class, meaning that if we are talking about transition taxonomy, it seems to me that it deals with the corporate financing. So corporate that is planning to conduct a transition, then the plan is, I think, verify and suit with the standard, and it can have the access to like public instruments or bonds or capital market access. But to me, I think the more important thing is how can we define transition projects. What I mean is transition project, if it is a green project, it is clear that there is a solid business case behind what's called as a green project, because it deals with development. But when it comes to transition, you have to come with like a solid transition business case, and of course with the solid also transition contractual agreement behind that, so that we can, deliver more broadened participation of financing in the context of access to the public instrument. I think that is going to be the challenge, because transition deals with the change, not with the development. So access to finance is, of course, how can we have refinancing feasibility for supporting transition, not financing for a development. So I think that's the key issues, in discussing about transition taxonomy. Not only the taxonomy itself, but also how can we define clearly what is defined as a transition project. The same as asset class of the green projects or renewable project asset class.
Thank you, Pak Irwin. I think that's a really good point. So the time The difference between, let's say, a green project and a transition one is the element of time and the element of change over time. So what is that complexity in terms of a contractual arrangement? Because with renewable energy, okay, you're building something and then we walk away and we're assuming it's going to be good all the way through. But with transition, you almost need to have a promise made, but that promise seen through over, I don't know, 10, 15, 20 years' time. How do you maintain that? How do you build it into contracts? That's a really critical point. Would you like to go first? Next?
Yeah, well, thank you so much. Pleasure to be here. I guess I'll start a little bit from the context of RMI and the type of work that we do. And as a global think tank that is focused on transforming the global energy system, we're working in a few different ways on transition and transition finance. Really, for us as an organization, we have led research, worked with a range of different institutions, both commercial, financial, industrial, and power sector entities, as well as supported the development of guidelines, standards, and taxonomy. So kind of cutting a little bit of a cross-programmatic or cross-disciplinary role. And for us, there are three main areas that we've really focused on. First is really around developing guidance on sectoral climate alignment for private financial institutions. Second is really digging in a little bit more on metrics and guidelines that support a credible managed phase-out of coal specifically. And third, really working with financial sector and other entities on the implementation of some of these guidelines and standards. And I'll say for us, like a guiding principle underlying a lot of this work is really a strong focus on ensuring that we're channeling finance to enable a transition in the real economy rather than just incentivizing divestment. And we heard a bit of that in the last panel. And in particular, really starting to move more towards the entity level and the project level. So I'll just say, like, we kind of work at three levels in terms of how we think about our research and the implementation of taxonomies and standards and guidelines: sectoral, entity, and then project. Maybe a few examples of where we've done some of this work. At the sectoral level, we've worked to align private financial institutions around key topics and issues. So first was really around something called the Poseidon Principles, which was really around the creation of a sector-based, science-based target pathway for the shipping sector. That was around 2018. Last year, there was quite a bit of work in sustainable steel, around sustainable steel principles. So again, bringing 6 banks together to align on a commitment for a 1.5 degree aligned pathway. And then third, over the past year, RMI has released a series of what we'd call like working papers on various topics related to a managed and just phase out of the coal sector. So this includes guidelines on credibility, but also a working paper on metrics, and a third working paper on financial mechanisms or tools. And I think I just wanted to pick up on a theme that was mentioned here already around transition and the evolution of this work. And I think for us, the way that we're approaching this is that we need to learn by getting started and by doing. So we're starting with a certain set of perspective based on where we're at today. That's going to evolve over time, in particular as we start moving into specific projects. And I think for us, we see a real opportunity as we shift from a discussion around taxonomy to really start moving towards entity-level transition planning and project-specific implementation that will provide the basis for learning and demonstrating success as it relates to some of the initial criteria that you might outline in a taxonomy or standard. So just want to say that I think we're really excited about some of the implementation that's happening more broadly, but in particular in Indonesia, and RMI is working quite closely and committed to bringing some of our expertise to bear in Indonesia, given the stated leadership and commitment from the Indonesian government and also organizations like ADB and a range of other organizations around the table. I guess the final thing I'll say is we as RMI really focus on bringing cross-disciplinary expertise. And I think we feel that that's really critical, in particular as you start bringing multiple stakeholders around the table to align on just transition and transition pathways. So for us, we see the need to have expertise in power system planning, deep understanding of the assets themselves, in addition to like social economic impact and the impact on communities, and then into the financial sector and financial transition pathways. And all of that needs to be kind of brought together into a more harmonious and synthesized approach. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Coben. And I think I wanted to pick up on one of the points that you talked about, because I'd like to come back to it later, which is in addition to having more guidance on what kind of transition plan looks like, you do need to have pretty solid, or at least some kind of evidence around a sector pathway. And it's interesting to hear that RMI has been doing work like that. I'd be interested to hear a bit more about it later on. But before that, David, would you like to introduce the work that you're doing, ADB is doing on transition?
Well, thanks, Naida. First, I'd like to say it's a pleasure to be here. I still feel in-person events are a bit of a novelty. Being here with some existing friends who I work with regularly. On one side, I'm meeting a new friend who I'll get to know shortly, seeing a number from the previous panel, and in the audience who I've only met virtually still. And so it's really exciting, and this really is about a journey. You know, we're hearing these words like pathways and getting started on towards a destination, and really energy transition is that. And when we look at the energy sector work in ADB, the only work we're doing is energy transition work, because we have chosen to invest in only some parts of the energy sector today. But I think the term that was used in the earlier session was an exclusionary approach to energy transition. And that's why I'm really excited about the work that we're doing on the energy transition mechanism, because I think that is very much moving away from that exclusionary only approach, or choosing only to do certain topics, but takes the energy transition theme that really meets countries where they're at. And that, to me, is really the power of the energy transition, and the transition approach is that it's not only looking to where we want to go, but looking at the starting point. And that's really the complete way to look at a journey. And in the work that we do in ETM, we often talk about it under 4 Ps. So the first one we always start with is people. The service that energy provides has a direct impact on people, on society and businesses, but also those who are involved in that. So any transition, we have to make sure that no individuals or no communities are left behind as we transition from, say, fossil fuels towards clean energy. The second P is policy. And this policy has such a significant impact, and taxonomy is one part of that, as to what can be invested on, or what is incentivized, or what is discouraged. And in that respect, policy is a very important part of the work that we do. Now, we're focused at first on the power sector. I know industrial sectors are also very important, but just for power, so that's a third P. We'll have to figure out how to come up with a P for the industrial sectors, but I'll just focus on power for now. The system has to work. And you know, it's what I find really interesting is sometimes I hear from outside people criticize Indonesia because they have oversupply. Well, oversupply is better than undersupply, because the power keeps flowing, society keeps moving, and businesses and industry are able to continue to contribute. So we have to do this in a way that if we especially remove certain power sources, or we add new ones that are different, that like solar and wind that are variable, we have to make sure that technically this works, and it's part of a plan for economies such as Indonesia and many others in the ASEAN region that are growing dramatically. And this provides a hugely different context compared to developed countries that have very strong systems today that are growing only at a small rate. It's easier to transition those. So the challenge is really here. And then the last P is partnerships. And, you know, again, we see that with the range of speakers, both in this panel, the previous panel, and in the room, where we need experts from the power sector, from the financial community, from the policy and regulatory side. We need to bring all of these together, and then equally, we need to bring those from developed countries, from developing countries, from cold climates to tropical climates, to really understand how we can do this in a way that moves us at the right pace, because as you said, Naida, this is very urgent. Let me close there. Thank you.
Thank you, David, and also for the multiple P's that we need to be focusing on as we go forward. Tim, would you like to tell us about what you do on transition and how it complements?
Yeah, I was going to suggest production as your fourth P for the industrial processes. I'm going to have a little bit about, so we are a management consulting firm, so we provide advice to our clients, many of whom are financial institutions, and particularly we have a long legacy of providing kind of risk management advice to banks. So our involvement here kind of logically started from there, and I'm going to tell a little bit of the history of how we've done, because I think it's relevant to this conversation. So we really started out with some work with the UNEP-FI program on the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. And I think at the time, the theory from policymakers and regulators is, if we can force everybody to quantify how they are exposed to transition risk, they will realize that some of their companies are more risky than others. They'll change the cost of financing, and this will crowd in private sector finance towards the transition. And that kind of half worked. I think what we found was actually the near-term risks to financial institutions are not nearly great enough to really incentivize fast enough action. But in the process of creating disclosures, we created pressure from investors. And that pressure from investors, and I think it's a really important point that we don't lose sight of as we talk about transition, is that pressure from investors is working. So it is pressure from investors that is forcing banks to set net zero targets. It's pressure from investors and banks that is forcing corporates to make transition plans and to change what they're doing. But also it wasn't enough. So what we then got involved with was, okay, now we want to be starting to set our own transition path towards net zero as a financial institution. So what does that mean? We need to understand what that means as a pathway, what it means in terms of short-term goals that we can set ourselves. And so we as an organization then worked with the Glasgow Financial Alliance for net zero on trying to set standards at an industry level, and we worked with all of our clients in the private sector to think about how do we navigate this world of different pathways, what's the right set to do, what can we really achieve, what are the set of actions that we would need to take to do so. In ASEAN, that journey started a little later, but it is now in full swing as well. So our clients in the region, the banks here, many of them have started to commit to join the Net Zero Banking Alliance. They're setting their own net zero plans as well. And they're often doing so in a pretty ambitious way. But invariably, when we start the conversation, they're pretty nervous. They know that they're in a region which doesn't have the same policy tailwinds as perhaps exist in Europe and North America, that we exist in a region with the youngest coal-fired power plants in the world, so we have a big economic challenge here as well. And we have been helping them to think through what are the right transition pathways, what's an appropriate transition pathway for the region that we're in, so that we can commit to that path towards 1.5 degrees, towards net zero in 2050 at a global level, and for that to still be a realistic plan for the region.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks for that introduction. So from what I can hear from across all the four speakers, who are from quite different types of institutions, so the financer, the thinker, the supporter, the advisor, let's say, if you're going to label it. But the common message that I'm able to get out is that we've kind of done this journey now on defining green finance. So we started where there was no definition of green finance, then we went with the definition of green finance broadly globally, but it was pretty loose. There's criticism. Then we went with an exclusionary green versus non-green. And I think now we're coming back to, well, green is about broader than green, but you need to have decent standards and metrics in place to make sure that it really, everything in the spectrum really is about enabling that environmental impact. So to start with, I'd like to ask maybe Tim and Coben, if you could give us some thoughts on what would a credible transition standard look like? What are the elements that it should include? We heard about taxonomy today, but a standard more broadly.
Should I start on this one?
Please go.
So I think at its heart, the core requirement for a successful transition standard is that it helps to clear the market. And what I mean by that is we need to find something that investors want to invest in and which is an available asset class that corporates will develop. We have projects on the other side. So then if you kind of unpick that a little bit, the next thing to think about is that actually the investor universe is quite diverse, and there's lots of different investors that we're looking at here. We have retail investors, we have institutional investors, we have banks, we have corporates as a potential investor base. And they have quite different interests in what they'll invest in. They have different standards. At heart, though, I think there's a few things that are key here. Everybody wants a standard which is science-based. I think it's pretty clear that the goal now is 1.5 degrees warming, and that means net zero by 2050 at a global level. And that we have to avoid accusations of greenwashing. So all investors are worried that they don't want to invest in something that says it's green and then isn't, and gets them in trouble with their investors further down the line. From the asset owner side, from the corporate side, we need to then set standards that are available and that are economic today. So it's very easy for us to set a standard which is too strict. It's also very easy for us to set a standard that is too light. If we do either one of those things, the market won't clear. We'll have a standard which is effectively useless. So I think the ways in which we start to address that, we need a way of unpicking a set of global sectoral views towards net zero into a regional cut of that. We need, and I think this is a gap in the science at the moment, we need a way of doing that which bridges the sort of top-down view of carbon budgets and how sectors need to evolve with the bottom-up view of where did the industry sit today. I think that's a gap in the science today as well. So I think a credible standard is going to be one that brings together both of those views, that is still scientific, that is still within the budget of 1.5 degrees, that is net zero by 2050, but that marries the local view as well. I have kind of two other points I think which are really relevant, which are really important here. One is that that standard cannot be allowed to dilute the success of investor pressure. So what I said before, forcing people to report has created investor pressure, which is forcing action. And we don't want to lose that. So I think the very worst set of transition standards that we could create would be ones that allow investors back into asset classes, that move away from the economic pressure that has created so far. And then a final one, which I think is a really interesting challenge, is I think we're still missing the group in our standards, which is the group that's going to pay for the transition. So what I mean by that is, when we close down a coal-fired power plant, that creates economic destruction. Somebody is going to have to pay for that. Either that's a government. Governments don't really want to do that, and it's not clear why they should. It can be the asset owner, but they're very heavily disincentivized to do so. It can be a financial institution, but it's pretty unclear why a financial institution would invest in value destruction as well. So in the end, it needs to be end users and companies that are looking to decarbonize but are not in the high emitting sector, through things like carbon offsets, through carbon markets, that will pay for this. And I think what we're missing in the standards at the moment as well is a better definition of offsetting activity that will allow those companies to come in and provide the finance.
Thanks very much, Tim. And actually, some of the discussions as well at the moment in the region, at least, are focusing very much on transition standards, but from the context of decarbonizing the power sector. But we haven't really touched on beyond that. The transition issue in Indonesia certainly is about coal, but in other countries, it's actually may not be as much about coal, especially in this region. Maybe we've not quite got far enough on those discussions yet. Coben, what about from your perspective? What would a credible transition standard look like to you? Is there one already out there? What do you reckon?
Yeah, well, maybe like an initial kind of starting point, building off of what Tim said. I mean, I think one of the biggest challenges that we're facing right now is finding the space between something that is credible and provides clarity, and essentially a minimum threshold for what we want to see from both a climate and a social integrity perspective, but allows for enough flexibility to be adapted to either different geographic contexts, to different technology or project-based or sector-based contexts, as well as that can be adaptable over time. And I'd say for RMI, we've done a bit of work on this through kind of a collaborative process, in particular around managed phase out from a power sector perspective. And what the approach that we took was working to set minimum thresholds. Basically, there's a certain level of where we think that we can get to today that provides clarity around both environmental and social impact that should allow for financing to flow today to sets of projects and to institutions that are aligning their planning processes and the types of projects they're advancing with those minimum thresholds, while then putting in place guardrails, kind of questions and other areas where we can continue to evolve and iterate work over time. There are 4 areas that we've identified that kind of set the pillars for credibility, and I think this is specific to the power sector but would be applicable across multiple sectors. First is really just around climate impact. We've talked a lot about this, but really at the end of the day, what we want to be able to see is demonstrated emissions reduction. And that is something that you can define. Second would be social protection, so ensuring that people and communities are not going to be left behind and that they're going to be appropriately supported. On both fronts, then, the third pillar is really around transparency, in particular around reporting and monitoring. So are the procedures in place, is the data available now and in the future to be able to measure the impact of that project and the financing that's supporting it. And then fourth is really around a softer topic, but more around governance and incentive structures. So how are you thinking about accountability and some of the non-financial outcomes or the outcomes that are less easily tracked? So those are some of like the 4 pillars that I'd say that we're looking at. Yeah, maybe I'll leave it there. I think there's more that we can talk about, but thanks.
Thanks, Coben. And I think that you raised a really good point, especially around the monitoring and evaluation that brings it back to what Edwin was saying earlier about transition as an asset class and contractual arrangements. If you're going to have to monitor whether somebody stays on a transition path or a project delivers the kind of emission reductions you want against a pathway at the start when you plan the project, how are we going to, what kind of contractual arrangements does a bank like PTSMI have to have in place, and for how many years to make sure that actually happens, because what they were financing was transition. I don't have an answer, but it's a good question that we have to resolve in any work around transition standards. But maybe if I can flip to the other part of the discussion, because you were saying, Tim, right at the start, the whole point of a transition standard is to mobilize more finance. But on the flip side, so while we're developing the perfect, or not the perfect, but a standard, let's say, is there a pipeline of projects in this region? I mean, those of us working in the financial sector, or especially public finance side, we've been talking about where is the pipeline for years. So on transition particularly, is there a pipeline in this region, and what do we need to build it? Maybe I can ask Edwin, in Indonesia, is there a transition pipeline?
I think if we are talking about pipeline can be pipeline for private finance and pipeline for the public finance. Of course, public finance deals with the social economic impact of the transitioning of the energy itself. But when it comes to pipeline for private finance, of course, we start from the mainstream of, I think, coal phase out. We have at least 2 pipelines. One is the asset spin-off modality pipelines, where we deal with PLN in the context of spinning off PLN coal power plant into a specific SPV, and that's what I call transition project asset class. So we try to mobilize blended finance for refinancing modality in order to get cheaper cost of capital. So that's going to be the modality of finance that we are going to drive. At the end of the day, the aim is for getting emission reduction or emission, I think emission avoidance, yeah, lesser emission avoidance. I think that is going to be one approach. So we are building a new asset class other than corporate asset class on the PLN side. So that's going to be a challenging one. And I think the other modality is we deals with, I think that's INA approach, yeah. Dealing with the existing asset class, which is like IPP coal power plant. So I think we are part of INA in providing equity modality to this and try to renegotiate or readjust, yeah, the contractual agreement from the original IPP coal into like coal phasing out. I don't know what would be the end of the negotiation, whether it is going to be like combined with or linked with the element of renewable or not, but that's going to be the definition of transition asset class that we are aiming to. Yeah, so those two pipelines, I think, would showcase our effort, yeah, in trying to like avoid emission in the future. I think that's going to be the major private finance pipeline, and by the existence or by the upcoming taxonomy, then of course project can have a better access to like bond issuance or publicly issued instrument. So it gives broader, participation financing. Yeah? Not only from the broader participation point of view, but also we expect that we can have more diverse financing spectrum. Whether it is, like I mentioned before, in equity piece, concessional, government support, or even in the form of carbon finance. So that is our aspiration, when it comes to transition taxonomy. How can the taxonomy link to the carbon monetization? I think that's going to be quite a challenge going forward. Yeah, I think that's maybe answer your question.
Thank you, Pak Edwin. And for distinguishing quite clearly the two types of pipeline, at least in Indonesia, and you're absolutely made an excellent point that the taxonomy is going to help, hopefully, help diversify the sources of financing if these projects or when these projects materialize. David, from your perspective, because you've been working on kind of, operationalizing the ETM, do you see a similar pipeline? Do you see it as broader? Does it vary across the region?
Well, I'll start by saying I started my career in solar energy. And I remember at that time, the price of solar was about 50 euro cents. So that was probably about 60 cents a kilowatt hour in USD. And I remember thinking, I can't see how this is ever going to happen, but we get orders of magnitude more sun coming into the planet than the total amount of energy that we use. So we need to figure out how to do this. So that to me was the simple motivation. So taking it to energy transition and finding deals to accelerate the retirement or decommissioning of coal. Well, there's a lot of coal plants in the region. So I'd say there's a huge pipeline. So that just simply that macro level context means to me that there is a pipeline. We just have to figure out how to do it. And so, Pak Edwin, I appreciate went quite practical. So I'm going kind of academic. So I apologize, but this is how I get up and out of bed in the morning to think. Okay, I don't know exactly how we're going to get there, but I see the potential. And I'll just say, to Tim, just you talked earlier about the destruction of value. And yes, I don't disagree with that, but I would rather reframe it. Because we need a managed phase out is not necessarily destroying value. It's rather bringing in the correct externalities to say we want to still keep doing or creating the same product, but we want to do it in a different way. So by bringing those externalities in, we're just saying, look, we didn't count them before, and therefore we need to find a way to move, again, transition from doing it in a way that really includes all those externalities or does this in a way that meets, you know, broad goals including just transition, environmental aspects and economic aspects. So all that to say at a macro level, I see that there is opportunity here. We can create the frameworks that will make this an investable approach on both sides of reducing what we don't want to do and increasing what we do want to do while still providing the service. So that's the macro level. But then specifically on pipeline, we are going through a process right now as part of the ETM program where we are reaching out to a broad set of community, of the community of owners of plants. And plant owners actually want to make this transition. They see the time frame from using fossil fuels and specifically coal as limited. They see the timeline for renewables and clean energy production as unlimited. That in itself is a great business opportunity. So they're saying, okay, if you can help me manage this, and they're excited, of course, about the concessional funding, which eventually will not be enough, but then it's creating those frameworks, say carbon pricing and other approaches that will disincentivize this action and incentivize and make this more investable and more opportunity for making profits while providing these needed services. We're seeing tremendous excitement in this, but the first thing we need to do is demonstrate with a few projects, and that's where we're partnering with PTSMI, other Indonesian stakeholders such as INA, to really do those first projects. And then I think we're going to see where the challenges are and where the opportunities are, and that's going to help us grow our pipeline.
Thanks, David. Thanks for flagging that and also for pointing out that there is, of course, this macro pipeline in the region. It's just about, maybe not just, it's hardly just as we know. It's about demonstrating and showing how that works. So if I can ask you a follow-on question, ETM is trialing one type of financing mechanism. Could you tell us a bit more about that? And beyond that, what are the other types of financing instruments and mechanisms that we need to scale up transition finance?
Sure. So the first part, the first transaction that we're working on is to essentially relever the asset, which is a common transaction for many pieces of infrastructure where the debt has been partly paid down, and now the remaining value in the plant is largely equity. If we can turn some of that equity back into debt, we can do it at a lower cost of capital. And instead of just putting that in the pockets, we're applying some of that into reducing the life of the coal-fired power plant. So that's, I think, an elegant approach. It was not originated by us. It was originated by a person by the name of Don Kanak, and we're simply trying to apply that. So that's one approach. The other sustainability-linked projects, I think, are really an exciting part. This can be for, say, a utility or a company that has a portfolio of plants. And in this context, we're doing this, we're working on doing this, I should say, with PLN, which basically says, if you reduce your use of coal, we'll provide you low-cost capital to invest in renewables. So that, I think, is a really interesting approach. ASEAN Energy out of the Philippines basically did a corporate bond approach that said, that one's really interesting because it said, we as an institution are very strong corporately. We'll take some risk in order to get in low-cost investment in order to reduce the life of our coal plant. That one I think it really shows leadership. Not every company can do that. So I've just given 3 different models here of different approaches that can be used. But what I'm excited about is that once we start doing this, we're going to bring in the partners like GFANS, from the GFANS community that are much more sophisticated in project structuring than I think ADB is, or definitely than me as an engineer. But in that respect, we're going to see creative new approaches that will come. And I don't know, like when I worked in solar, I don't know what the future is going to look like. But if we can get started with credible approaches now, those evolutions will happen and be an ongoing cycle of improvement.
Thanks, David, and for clearly pointing out the 3 models and sustainability-linked loans. We touched on it just before as well, Edwin. Interesting to, especially in the context of working with companies that have more than one asset. From your perspective, you mentioned earlier also potentially carbon credits. What other instruments do you think, Edwin, we need to see to really scale up transition finance?
I think, of course, as part of our mandate is the government support, or this is something valuable for value addition to the projects. I think the availability of government support is something complementing the existence of private finance. Many government support can be explored. Of course, the main or the primary menu is, of course, concessional loan, but there are also other possibility of obtaining government support in variety of form, but it has to be conducted in a PPP modality. So there must be some transparent, competitive bidding process in the process of, first of all, creating a transition asset class, and of course the element of best competitive bidder who are going to be the one who get access to that kind of government support. So I think for that one, I think we are still thinking of getting into other variety of government support, whether it is in the form of VGF or, because it's quite tricky when you talk about electricity sector, it is always handicapped by the affordability as mentioned by Ibu Menteri, and that is also the element of subsidy, implicit subsidy given to the people. So what is the sort of transitioning the mechanic of subsidy by on the other hand and shifting into other form of subsidy indirectly in the form of government support or viability gap, government guarantee, and other form of government support, that gonna be quite interesting transition, support given to the project as long as it fulfill the principle of affordability and it fulfill the principle of competitive and accountable bidding process. So that kind of modality can be also explored in the future.
Thank you for raising that. I think that's a really critical point because David, you mentioned earlier concessional financing. That's how ETM is trying, but of course there isn't enough of it. So eventually it has to come back to some level of government guarantee, we know, or government support. We know there isn't enough public finance possibly to make this happen. So how do you leverage and better use? Is it a guarantee or other mechanism? I think this is going to be a really interesting space to watch. And then using a taxonomy or an ASEAN standard to really link to some kind of VGF or other government financing pot that could be drawn down to manage a responsible phase out. I think that will be key. So it'll be interesting to watch how this space evolves. I think before opening up to the audience, I'd like to ask one more question, going back to Coben to what you talked about earlier about sectoral pathways. So one of the things that clearly came out in the last discussion, Eugene mentioned it, several people mentioned it, that a key to defining transition is science-based targets, is pathways. So in this region where we don't have the data and information, not necessarily all countries have well-established pathways out there, how do we do that benchmarking? Does there need to be some kind of medium-term plan and then a long-term plan? Or do we need to put in a massive effort, all of us working in this region, to like really define and institutionalize pathways?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a complicated question and it's an important one. I think where we've started is with both some core principles around what it looks like to do sectoral planning and pathway setting, as well as establishing an initial set of market leaders who are interested in engaging in that effort. So it might not necessarily be an entire sector-wide full effort, but starting with an initial set that are saying, look, we have a set of discrete investments in this sector. We are committed to moving towards a science-based or climate-aligned sectoral target. What that will look like and the process of doing that often will take place over a period of time. But you start with both the initial commitment, the interest, and enough kind of movement from a certain set of actors to move in that direction. From there, then you can start to work into kind of an iterative target planning exercise. So whether it's looking out to 2050 initially and starting to step back, but really doing the maths on what a science-based target would look like for that sector, and then the initial sets of investments. Oftentimes, and I think we've heard it here from a couple different folks on the various panels, is some ratcheting, where you're actually going to look to step up ambition over time and both clarify with additional metrics what the phasing of the sectoral pathway might look like. So often you just have to get started someplace. A commitment is a good place to start, setting a certain pathway, starting to collect the data, monitoring actual investments, and then moving forward as some of the data and the information becomes clear. I'd say beyond that, we're seeing a lot of progress at the entity level, where individual organizations are starting to set much clearer transition pathways. I mean, in the region, we've seen planning and efforts from groups like DBS and others that are starting to outline their own kind of investment pathways on a sector-by-sector basis. And so I think you can start to attack it from multiple angles, both on an individual sector basis, but also on an entity level, looking at their investment on a sector-by-sector basis.
Thanks, and I think the point there really is we have to start somewhere, in some ways I think international financing institutions that work across more than one country, even like us, we have some flexibility to set our own pathway and decide to go for certain types of assets in different sectors. We're having that discussion at ADB all the time with our increasing work on Paris, aligning our pipeline with the Paris Agreement. But we're able to leverage the differences across multiple countries. I think, for example, PTSMI or others that are working in a country and are focused on really supporting that agenda, where there is the absence of a well-defined national pathway, then it's there's a kind of a little bit of a gap before you can really kind of properly establish I'm on this pathway or the other. But Tim, do you have any views on this? Like, what can we do in the medium term for those that are following national pathways?
Yeah, so I think I agree with Coben. We have to work with what we have, but I also think what we have is not that bad these days. So having helped a number of institutions really kind of think through the available pathways that are there and what they could use to be setting their own transition pathways, there's a plethora of available transition pathways for you to start with. So you have all the IAMs, so the IEA, the NGFS, the One Earth Climate Model, etc. You increasingly have, in addition to that, what I think is some very high quality sectoral pathways aimed at specific sectors. So the Poseidon principles for shipping, the carbon risk real estate monitor group for real estate, the IATA Fly Net Zero path for aviation, the Mission Possible partnership work on steel. All of these are quite detailed technological pathways at a sector level that are quite credible. So I think we start actually from a world where a lot of thinking has been done on sectoral pathways, and we've got something to get going with. I think where you're right that there's a real challenge is when we try to take that from a global sector level to a regional or a really local sector level. And there, you know, the IAMs fall down pretty badly. A lot of them use relatively simplistic top-down allocation methods. When we've looked at them, they diverge from each other wildly. They require you to accept different assumptions. They're not really fit for purpose when you try to split them down into very kind of regional levels at the moment. I think that's less true of the really detailed pathways, the sort of individual sector ones that exist. And then the other challenge is just that what the pathways say and what the policy and companies are doing don't line up either. And that's a policy problem. Yeah, we don't yet have NDCs that are lined up to 1.5. We have companies that are setting decarbonization pathways, but are not quite ambitious and fast enough. So you have and I think that's just a problem anywhere in the world for any company any financial institution looking to finance towards the transition is we need the real economy to be moving faster as well.
So just one more, which wasn't a question originally that I was going to ask you, but on that point, because you work across so many different countries, are there examples, or what are the examples of countries where there are well-established national pathways? I mean, are countries doing this, where they publish this? I mean, in our region, it's not in that level of detail. So if you looked elsewhere in the world, are people really putting out there, this is what our pathways look like for energy sector, for transport sector up to 2050? Like government?
So they do exist. So governments don't do them. Because governments have their NDCs. And it's difficult, I think, to set out a path to net zero and an NDC and not have those two things be the same thing. So what you tend to see is private sector and academic groups are coming together and then setting a pathway towards net zero, usually for an individual sector. So you see things like the UK's real estate plan towards net zero as an example of that. And then the other place where I think you see this is international sectoral pathways to net zero who have done a bit of extra work and said, okay, this is what that means for different countries. So the Mission Possible Partnership pathway for steel, for instance, it has a view on China, which is different to its view for the rest of the world. It has a view for Europe, which is different from its view of China. It has a view for ASEAN, which is different as well. So, and I think what we need is just more and more and more of that kind of work being done that says, here's what needs to happen in total, here's what needs to happen therefore for this sector, and then when I marry that together with the realities of the countries that we're operating in, here's what that means at a country level for the sector. And that needs to go beyond, we have developing countries and developed countries and different countries can afford things, into technological impediments like we have lots of young coal-fired power plants in Indonesia. We have a small country with high population density in Singapore that doesn't have a feasibility really to get to 100% renewable energy. And therefore, when we marry the technological barriers and the top-down view, here is a reasonable answer, which is just and achievable at a country level. And I think we're getting there, but we're not there yet.
Thank you very much, Tim. And I think that was also a positive message. So we don't have to wait for super detailed pathways to be coming out from the agencies that develop NDCs. It could come out from other parts of think tanks, from universities, from the private sector, and they could still be credible and could be usable in the medium term. I'd like to now open out to the audience who have been listening patiently for 2.5 odd hours and to ask if there are any questions on transition. And I will flag that Eugene is also here, as is Yuki. So any other tough questions that this panel cannot answer, I will definitely turn it around. So yeah, to the gentleman in orange. Just a quick introduction and the question, please. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Martin from PT SMF. PT SMF is the older sister of PT SMI. So basically, I have 2 questions. The first question is actually for the financer, the thinker, the advisor, and the supporter. So what do you think that the regulators need to provide, to expedite the process of the transition? Because one of the missing key is a clear and transparent regulatory framework that discipline and protecting all the stakeholders in the, in the transition process. That is my first question. My second question is rather, well, actually, I do not know to whom I should address this question. But anyway, let me ask the question, say the question. So, one of the issues when we phasing out, the coal phasing out in the power sector is, what is the short-term and medium-term impact? Because, in Indonesia, when we talk about Java and Bali, yes, the household enjoys tremendous quality of, electricity services. But what happened in Sumatra, what happened in Kalimantan, what happened in Papua, the story is completely different. So when we start phasing out, I believe there is an impact to brothers and sisters from the other part of Indonesia. So what do you think is the short term and the medium term social cost of coal phasing out in the power sector? Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? It'd be good to take a couple to start with. Okay, think about it, we'll come back. So maybe to start with the first question, top message, what do the regulators need to do to manage the transition? Edwin. Just the top message.
I think I would prefer to answer the second question rather than let the other panelists.
Yeah, I mean, I guess given a lot of my work and a lot of our work on some of these topics have related to the power sector, I think about power sector regulators. But regulators generally, I think there's a really important role for regulators to play in terms of kind of defining the rules of the road. I think as we heard in the last panel, there is an element of regulators not stepping too far out in front of where the current market is at. So thinking about what the kind of phased approach is to setting rules of the road, doing that through a kind of an inclusive process that allows for different voices to come in to help to define and bring in and address some of the externalities that may not have always been addressed previously but need to be addressed as part of the transition, and start to account more accurately for the types of like aligning implementation, transition finance projects to the vision for the next phase, and whether that's 5 years out, 10 years out, beyond. I guess for me, a final piece that I'll just say that at least for us as RMI is pretty important is taking a bit of a technology agnostic approach. So setting certain outcomes and for regulators to define, this is where we want to get to. What is the vision for our power system, for our overall energy system? And setting the right metrics, the right process to allow for technologies and different projects to compete on the basis of the outcome you're trying to achieve, rather than other inherent kind of agendas associated with the technology itself. And that could be a range of pieces. I mean, we've heard a lot, first and foremost, around security and reliability, affordability, but also broader economic productivity. So economy-wide productivity. So there's a range of different things you need to consider, and the regulator in many ways is kind of setting the container for that conversation and to allow for alignment on setting the rules for where we are now and where we want to get to.
I'll make a small comment. There is no perfect regulation or regulatory regime in any country. That's for certain. But I do think that the incremental changes that need to happen that are aligned with the long-term goal, and that's where so often when someone comes from outside a country, they will often look at, this needs to be fixed, this needs to be fixed, this needs to be fixed, and maybe 2 out of 3 of those are just politically unpalatable. And that's the reality, is that energy is politicized, and within countries and globally. And so, I really think understanding the goals, and that's why I'm so encouraged in Indonesia. There are issues with the regulations in Indonesia. We could all name them. But having a deep understanding to know what can be changed quite easily to accelerate or encourage the energy transition, and what is just that big one that is going to be super hard that we shouldn't ignore, but we should actually maybe leave it alone as a second priority in the near term. So I really think that deep country understanding and what's achievable is really important to understand in order to get started, instead of trying to fix it all at once, because there is no perfect regulatory environment. It must be done incrementally.
So I wrote down 3 things, which was unblock, prod, and incentivize. So I think the thing that regulators can do and policymakers can do is unblock things that are blocked. So there's loads and loads of private finance that is ready to fund economically viable green transition projects with a lower return expectation than they have in non-green projects. But a lot of those are not happening because regulation gets in the way and stops things from happening. So my number one ask of the policymaker would be, get out of the way, unblock the process. On the prod part, I think we've seen a lot of movement when regulators force financial institutions to do assessments of transition risk, when they force companies to be reporting their emissions. So keep doing that, prod companies. And then on incentivize, we need a fiscally neutral way for governments to accelerate the transition is effectively to act as is to tax one half of the economy and subsidize the other half. So I think I'm encouraged by what Ibu Shumiang was saying earlier about introducing carbon taxes, introducing incentives. We need more of that in order to accelerate because that will create the economic incentives that will get financed if we're not in the way.
Thanks, and I would add to that to say that from the financial sector's perspective, I actually think that we're doing an okay job on regulators and the role of financial regulators by the work we've seen on taxonomy, what's happening in national context, what we're seeing on disclosure, on requirements for stress testing in banks. That's all kind of going in the right way from a regulator's perspective for finance and green finance. But maybe the second tough question, Edwin, would you like to take that one? What happens when you phase out in one region? Does the other region phase?
Yeah. When it comes to energy transition and the mainstream is coal phase out, we understand very clearly that I think coal is very important sector to Indonesia. Even the backward linkage and the forward linkage of the coal itself is very big. Yeah, even we have a research on that. Even it has the output impact of more than 1 time. So backward linkage and forward linkage is pretty big. So I think transition is about a resource allocation, and I agree with incentive mechanism that has to be go in parallel, with the intervention. I think the adoption of carbon tax, I think is one thing that can affect the resource allocation, and it is also the importance of the support to the impacted regions. For instance, in the form of redistribution the money to mitigate or to compensate the negative impact to some region is very important, and we in PTSMI fortunately we have the we call it the public finance facility, where we have the local government finance portfolio, so that we can also create a kind of thematic program on tackling with the region with resources, fossil element. So I think that kind of program can be also the compensating factor tackling this negative impact of the national program in terms of coal decommissioning. And the other alternative, I think, is also, because when you talk about the electricity sectors, it is the sector that is heavily subsidized. So it can also be the right way to transform the mechanic of subsidy in a more targeted way, and removing the kind of indirect subsidy. As you may understand, there is also a DMO obligation for coal, which is implicit indirect subsidy. So that kind of fiscal policy can also be implemented, in tackling the negative impact of the energy transition program, which is in particular case is coal decommissioning, for instance. And other element of fiscal can be also implemented, but again, it is it has to be like specific or targeted fiscal policy imposed to tackle the region or impacted region of this energy transition program. I think that's my point of view.
Thank you, Pak Edwin. Any further questions from the audience? Oh, two more, okay. Oh, three actually. We'll take all three and then that'll be it, I think.
Thank you. My name is Gan from PT SMI. My question is addressed to Keuangan, David and Tim. What will be your advice for Indonesian government to accelerate the implementation of carbon market and carbon tax so that the economic value of carbon could play a significant role in sustainable finance in this country? Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. My name is Jordan Lee from the Tony Blair Institute. First of all, thank you so much for the very insightful panel discussion. And my question is for the whole panel, but it does focus on a point that David raised regarding changing the discussion from, let's say, or reframing the discussion from destruction of value to incorporating certain externalities. And my question would be, who is best positioned to incorporate those externalities? And what can we learn from previous efforts to do a similar thing, such as protecting the ozone through reducing emissions of CFCs and HFCs? Thank you.
I think there was one more question from the back of the room. No? Yes? Okay. Let's go with those two first. We just start with Keuangan. Would you like to start? Or Tim?
I can take this. I think they're kind of the same question, actually. So your question on externalities and who should pay for them, I think carbon taxes is the obvious answer to that question, and governments, I think, is the right group to be charging for externalities. So I think the way that you reframe the argument, it becomes about getting rid of value destroying assets rather than getting rid of value creating assets, which is still a difficult investment case to make, but it is an investment case to make. The first question was, what would be my advice on carbon taxes and carbon market? So I think the carbon markets can be a really good way of bringing people who are willing to pay for decarbonization to people who need paying for decarbonization. And I think that's really a massive gap at the moment, because at the moment we're asking governments that are not really willing to pay for decarbonization, or we're asking companies that are definitely not willing to pay, or financial institutions that are also not really willing to pay. And I think what my number one piece of advice, my number one kind of desire here is that we can find a credible way in which things like early decommissioning of coal-fired power plants can be turned into offsets and linked to groups that want to buy offsets. I think there is a major gap in the climate finance market at the moment, which is that companies that are far removed from being high emitting, that want to offset their scope 3 emissions, their only option at the moment is the voluntary carbon markets, where something like 75% of all projects are nonsense and don't do any good. So we need to find a mechanism in the middle that creates real value creating climate saving projects and turns them into carbon offsets. And that needs to be coupled with better economic incentives through carbon taxes that should get introduced so that they become normal and then need to get escalated so that they continue to drive more and more economic incentives over time.
I won't touch on the carbon markets or carbon tax. I don't feel like I'm the strongest on this panel by far on that topic. But I will highlight one aspect. And it goes back to the first question that was raised from the audience as well. We often focus on, in today's discussion, was on the coal side of the equation. And in constrained markets where there's either not enough electricity production or very tight supply and demand, I think that bundling projects, so creating a project structure and where you have both the green side as the upside and you're using that to subsidize the downside potentially can provide a real opportunity and interesting product for developers to create and then investors to invest in. And so that's one of those areas where I think we can really create a lot of value that can support that need for electricity, because it goes back to Eugene's opening comment that there's still people in the region who don't have access to electricity, and we must address that. So that might be one of those tools. And to the point of how do we get the motivation, say, with respect to the externalities, I think it is there. I think it is evolving around the world. So you're seeing the entity level that Coben has highlighted a couple times. You are seeing the European Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. Did I get that right? You know, as another way to incentivize that. It's a bit of a stick, but it is a way to incentivize these changes. And then I think countries, well, like Indonesia, who has made broad, high-level commitments. And so I think it's coming. But the challenge is you do have a set of countries who are very wealthy who have largely caused the problem, and you do have countries who are coming up that development curve who are being asked to make sacrifices. That issue of fairness has to be addressed somehow, making sure that the opportunity, which I think is there, can really be captured by all, and especially developing member countries.
I'll be quite quick, and I'll talk a little bit on the carbon price and carbon market, carbon offset side. I think in particular there's a real need. I mean, our panel's talked a lot about credibility around transition and transition finance. I think as we bridge into discussions around carbon finance in particular and certain aspects of carbon finance, the threshold, as I talked about earlier, from a credibility perspective or minimum threshold is even higher in some respects, especially when you start thinking about VCM or the voluntary carbon market and what buyers will be, and especially like high quality buyers will be expecting to see in terms of the types of projects, validation of projects, and a demonstration of impact. So my only kind of advice there is as we talk about standards, as we talk about credibility, there is going to be a higher threshold in many instances when you start getting into carbon financing that we'll have to consider, and as a way of kind of bringing people around the table and demonstrating the viability of some of those financial models.
I think emission is a global public bet, as a contrary to public goods. Yeah. So of course it has negative externalities, and it is, I agree with all panelists that tax mechanism, carbon tax mechanism should be applied. But the issues is how can we develop mechanism which is fair to all countries, because tax is sovereign, and I think this mechanism has to be in parallel with also the incentive which is in this particular case is creation of the carbon market credit, and everyone or every nation should surely burden the negative externalities and, of course, create the opportunity to incentivize the one who is transitioning to decarbonization society. I think that's my point.
Thank you, Pak Edwin. So I think we've reached the end of our discussion. What we tried to do was to talk about what we need to do to really mobilize finance around the transition. For me, I think the kind of main takeaway, I'm not going to try and summarize, but just kind of like my closing feeling is that contrary to the we only have 7 years left, actually, we've kind of come on a journey around how we define green and how we define transition. We're at a place where transition is core to green, core to climate, our work on climate. But the taxonomy, which is a great step forward, is just the first step. Actually, we need a lot more work, but we need to do it kind of quickly. That's a bit of a gloomy message to end on. But I suppose flipping it around, a good way to look at it is that we've already come quite a long way. And at least we're now recognizing this as a core part of the agenda. Now we need to, as you're saying, there's pipeline, there's financing instruments. What we need is to demonstrate to scale up and to prod, to unblock prod and incentivize. Okay, thank you. I'll end on that. Thank you very much. Thank you to the great panel.
Thank you, Ms. Naida Krishna Morgado, and also our panelists for such fruitful discussions. Now I would like to invite our moderator and also our panelists to take a group photo together. I would like to invite our photographer and videographer to take a picture, please. On our count, yes, I would like to ask your very best smile. On our count, 3, 2, 1. All right, that will be all. Thank you so much, our moderator, Ms. Naida Krishna Morgado, and also our panelists for such fruitful discussion.
Thank you very much to our panelists for the fruitful discussion and to all moderators for moderating all panels in few hours. We'll conclude this seminar with closing remarks by Ms. Pande Putu Oka Kusuma Wardani. She is the Director of Center for State Revenue Policy. Please welcome Ms. Pande Putu Oka Kusuma Wardani. Ms. Pande Putu Oka Kusuma Wardani, the time is yours.
Thank you. Well, distinguished guests, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, Om Swastiastu, Namo Buddhaya, Salam Kebajikan, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. It is my honor to deliver closing remarks for the seminar today, since it has been a very interesting and fruitful discussion covering issues that are essential for the economic resilience and stability for the ASEAN region. As Her Excellency Sri Mulyani, the Indonesian Finance Minister, noted in her keynote speech, ASEAN economies face a huge task ahead of them, both in terms of the delivering actions to reduce climate emissions and also financing these actions. We have seen great progress in the ASEAN Sustainable Finance Agenda and also great progress at the national level by different ASEAN member states. In particular, the ASEAN Taxonomy for Sustainable Finance has helped to improve the region's financial sector readiness for transitions finance. With this taxonomy, countries have a guide that can be used to identify and classify sustainable projects and economic activities. At the same time, it caters to the diversity of different ASEAN economies, financial systems, and transitions pathways. We do hope that this taxonomy can improve the attractiveness of investment in the ASEAN region. By aligning the taxonomy with similar international standards, investors are expected to be able to more easily operate in the region. We now have version 2 of the taxonomy, which has expanded its focus to the energy sector. ASEAN is now starting to consider what should be the next area for focusing for this critical agenda. As we heard today, it is not enough to only focus on green investment. We must also focus on transitions investment and how it would be financed. And this is particularly so for the ASEAN region, given the heavily reliance on fossil fuels. The conversations on transitions and standards is still quite early in stages across the globe. We are not yet to see a common approach, and we are still at developing our capacity in this area. But given its strong track record in delivering concrete solutions to encourage sustainable finance in the region, ASEAN has the opportunity to lead the conversation on transition standards by making this as a focus of its future efforts. In today's seminar, we heard many insights from the private sectors on this, that it is important to make these standards aligned and credible with the pathway socially and economically, so it can mobilize capital optimally. In addition, it is also important to make it easy to understand and operationalize, especially if it is expected to encourage inclusivity towards broader participations, including MSME. And those insights will give all of us in ASEAN much to think about as we progress this agenda forward. Tomorrow, we will hear the Minister perspective on transitions finance. And let me take this opportunity to remind all attendees that we will reconvene the seminar at around 10:15 tomorrow for this final important session. And this will be a ministerial fireside chat focusing on financing transitions for ASEAN with Her Excellency Sri Mulyani Indrawati, Minister of Finance of Indonesia, His Excellency Lawrence Wong, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance of Singapore, and His Excellency Arkom, Minister of Finance of Thailand. Please join me in thanking all of the distinguished speakers who have joined us today, and I look forward to seeing you all again tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Pandey Putuoka Kusumawardeni, for the closing remark. You may return to your seat again. Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, we have had a productive, inspiring time together. And we now come to the end of seminar on financing transition in ASEAN. Ladies and gentlemen, we also provide you the QR code, which will be displayed on the screen. So please just scan the QR code to get this whole content of seminar on financing transition in ASEAN. And you may also access the feedback by scanning the QR code. And please kindly fill in and complete the whole question, because you may rename the certificate of this seminar by complete the feedback form. And we kindly inform seminar kit are provided next to registration desk.
And also, ladies and gentlemen, for all participants, we've already prepared the mailbox that presented in front of this foyer or in front of this ballroom, so you may take with you along the journey to your hotel room. And then also, we would like to inform you that we have MSME's exhibition area at the foyer area of BNDCC1, so please come and visit. And the third one, we also inform you that tomorrow, or following this agenda, is ministerial fireside chat that will be held tomorrow at 10:30 Bali local time. On behalf of the hosts and the committees, we would like to extend our deepest appreciations, and also we would like to thank you all for your support and active participations during the event. And I'm Faizur.
I'm Regine. We would like to signing off. Good afternoon. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Om Santi 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 Om.